their will upon nature. And he's probably saying that's really, they're similar to the Christians that came along, who are trying to impose their order upon nature. So he's claiming that their practice was the opposite of what they were preaching. I don't know. It's a bit of a long paragraph there. Number 9.
Still pulling it up. There it is. Oh, that's not bad. I'll paste it in. This is the Walter Kaufman translation. I'm going to be dropping in here. And let's see. Let's put this in one little piece at a time. That's the first part. And then this.
There's somebody named Wes in here. Whenever I see a name Wes, I think of Wes Anderson, the director. Wes, are you the Wes Anderson, the director?
Possible, but unlikely.
He's not answering because he's too big up there. So maybe it is the director.
He says no.
He said no? Oh,
in the chat.
Oh, okay.
It's going to take a little bit to paste in here, but it's coming.
Oh, audio to work. I see.
Next piece. 2 more to go here.
According to nature, you want to live? Oh, you noble Stoics, what deceptive words these are. Now, the Stoics, of course, were the inheritors of the new rational tradition, which had overturned that more ancient tradition, which we had, the Dionysian was an example of the more ancient tradition.
Right.
Now, Rudolf Steiner claims, in a sense, that Oedipus was this new rational tradition coming along, who had plastered his new generalized concepts onto the world. But it came at a price, that he had generalized things and had also lost observation in the process, had lost an aspect of information. Generalization's very handy.
Yes.
For getting results, taking us places, doing things. We can't build a moon lander and land on the moon without generalizing. But somewhere, something is lost. Observation is lost.
Yes.
Or to the point where we look upon the ancient culture with its mad gods and think those people were crazy. What were they on?
Yes. Yes.
Which was the Christian attitude when the Constantinian dynasty came up. Their attitude was, we have Christianity, a rational religion. The pagans are full of superstitious nonsense.
Right. And they wrote a lot of books that still survive to that very effect. We'll dig into that when we get into the medieval part. But I think you've selected an excellent piece of text here to look at, because the Stoics, of course, really rise to dominance after the peak of ancient Greek culture. So, Stoicism is most famously associated with the Roman Empire, which is much later. It's post-Alexandrian. And I think, first of all, I was pretty thrilled to have Kenneth Smith on last week. That was great. We'll see when we can get him on next. So he mentioned this idea that he's talked about before, that late in the ancient period, just like we're sort of in the late modern period, in the late ancient period, as in, again, the late medieval period, there's a rising corruption. There's a what Gilbert Murray calls in Five Stages of Greek Religion, there's a loss of nerve, that people no longer believe in the faith of the original revolution that launched the epoch. The things are not working, things are breaking down, they're frustrated, they're starting to question the things that they've never questioned before. And they're doing that at the same time, and in a sort of vicious cycle or feedback loop with the rise of corruption and the use of the outward forms of the culture for private gain and barbarism. So, you see some of that in Thucydides. Like F.M. Cornford says in Thucydides Mythhistoricus, this is the thing that Thucydides saw but didn't understand. But because he was such a good historian, he wrote it down clearly enough that modern historians can read it and see what he's describing, which is, Solon's reforms to the constitution allow the Banausoi to rise to power in Athens. The Piraeus, the neighborhood that's focused on trade and crafts, which is being fed commercially by the money from the Delian League, is creating a giant voting bloc that are not Aristoid, that don't believe in the core principles. They believe in, they're pragmatists. How do I get my cash, to pay my bills? And how do I make the most money possible? And they drag Athens and all of Greece into a destructive war. So we're seeing this is, by the way, at the same time that you've got the rise in sophistry, which is what section H is about in chapter 4. That we're going to talk about this late state. What he's going to do in chapter 4 is he's going to finish off by talking about the breakdown of the ancient worldview. But he's not actually taking us into Rome. He's just stopping with the breakdown among the ancient Greeks. And we all know there's many centuries that follow of the Hellenistic period and then the Roman period, where things just get more and more and more corrupt, falling further and further from the ideals that led to the launch of the ancient epoch to begin with. So last week, Kenneth mentioned something that he said before, which is one of the clearest ways to understand the Romans is not as the glorious precursors to ourselves, wonderful engineers and very well organized people. It's the mafia, it's the mob. It's about organization, but for what purpose? For the purpose of self-aggrandizement and corruption. That there's a reason why Rome falls, the Roman Empire falls in the end, because the vast majority of the population, faced with the prospect of losing the Roman Empire and being plunged into barbarism, looks around at their current lives and says, well, Jesus, it can't be worse than this. So all hail our conquering barbarians. They'll at least remove the Roman yoke off our necks. And, whatever we lose, it can't possibly be as bad as the gain, that we get by getting rid of that horror show. So sophism and corruption, which he's going to talk about in section H, this is the only place in chapter 4, which is ostensibly covering the ancient world, where he's just going to give a nod in the direction of the final, what is it? It's 500, 600, 700, and 750 to 800 years of the ancient epoch. He's just going to skip past with section H by using the sophists as a stand-in for everything that follows. And Stoicism is an example of a philosophy that rises to prominence in the midst of that corruption. How do people, and this goes right to our own lives, how do people grapple with living in a system that doesn't believe in itself anymore, and that's largely being run by the worst of us, a kakistocracy, or in which con artists are in charge of all of the major institutions, predators who are just looking to make a quick buck. This is what the Stoics are dealing with in the Roman Empire. Increasingly, as time goes on, they're looking around and going, God, it's all corrupt, it's all rotten. Ostensibly, that was what motivated Julius Caesar to cross the river and do what had never been done before, which is take a Roman army into Rome and conquer it and replace the republic with an empire. He does it ostensibly because the Senate is so rotten. It's just, the corruption is so awful. Everybody's talking about it all the time, and he's like, I can't possibly do worse than this, thus provoking the famous execution eventually. So what we're seeing is people grappling with collapse and chaos and disappointment and frustration and corruption in the Stoics. And you can see why Nietzsche, and thank you for bringing him up here, Stephen. You can see why Nietzsche would respond the way that he does, which is, you know, you look back at the archaic Greeks and the early Greeks, and you see something that Nietzsche talks about a lot, which is this incredible vitality, this kind of lust for life, this will to fully experience all of the emotions and experiences that life has to offer. And as Nietzsche points out, you know, even the brutal ones, even the ones that we in our post-Christian era call bad. You know, you shouldn't be angry, you shouldn't be violent, you shouldn't hate. And Nietzsche says, oh no, the ancient Greeks love to hate. They love to be violent. They like to have all the feelings that we are afraid of. We want to pick and choose which are the good feelings and which are the bad feelings, but they want to be fully alive. And Nietzsche admires them. So you can see why he would respond the way that he does here to the Stoics, who are saying, if we would just not want things, if we would just grit our teeth and endure and try not to be emotional, somehow we'll make it through this horrific series of centuries that are the, you know, long decay of the ancient epoch. So I think, you know, when you read these paragraphs that we copied in there that Kaufman's translated for us from the German, you know, I think you can see Nietzsche's ambivalence towards the Stoics. As much as they might be better than the corrupt people running the Roman Empire around them, by and large, they're still trying to live half a life, you know, in which if they hope if they just make themselves small enough, they won't be a target and they'll endure. I think we all, in our lives and in the people we've met who've talked to us about their frustrations with the way the world works, we've seen a wide variety of strategies that people have tried to adopt to try not to think too much about about what's happening, you know, because it's just too frustrating and aggravating. And if you directly confront it, you just get squashed like a bug. So this is what the Stoics are thinking about at the same period. And presumably, if we, you know, when we much later in this series, when we get into the medieval period, and we, you know, when we get through the peak of medievalism and get to the late medieval period where it's equivalent to this period with the Stoics or equivalent to our period now, we'll again see writers who are trying to figure out, how do I grapple with all this corruption around me in such a way that I don't get squashed like a bug? How do I survive and make it through this while trying not to be an awful, horrible, vitiated person? It's a recurring problem in the life cycle of an epoch. So highly apropos, Stephen. Thank you. It's very, very relevant to the text we're about to get into. So why don't I copy in our first paragraph of sophism and corruption here, and we'll see how far we can get through this. You know, I'll repeat something I've said before, which is when I first started reading Kenneth Smith, I had a low tolerance for his discussion of negative things. I wanted to read about him talking about, you know, aristoi and arete and how to live a glorious life. And I didn't want to read the stuff about banalsoi and douloi and sophistry, and all those things made me feel, you know, they made my skin crawl. And I would skim that stuff. But I've since come to understand that's like trying to be a doctor without studying disease. It's like if you want to make things better, if you want to figure out how to interact with things, you're certainly not going to get there by ignoring everything that's wrong and trying not to think about it too much. So what Kenneth's trying to do, and this takes a little while to fully appreciate, is he's not just trying to call names. He's not just saying the people in charge are poo-poo heads and I hate them. He's trying to anatomize their psychology, their character, the systems that they create, why they make the choices that they make, so that we can understand how things came to be the way they are. And maybe that'll help us to understand where things could potentially go in the future. Stephen, yeah, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I was just here on the main page. I was quoting that film Jack Nicholson was in called Wolf, which is sort of a remake of The Wolfman. Now, of course, Jack Nicholson plays the guy who's always been a nice guy, you know, always humble and letting other people step on him, and gets a werewolf disease in a film which never uses the word werewolf, and he bites back Now, of course, this is something which is coming back to the Dionysian. This is something we see in the early culture of the Greeks, which did actually have a cult of werewolvery. It was in I think it was in the Peloponnese somewhere, not too sure, somewhere near a school of lycanthropy, sort of thing. And of course, in the film, he visits an old professor who sort of looks at him in slyly and says, love without doubt, power without guilt. It feels good to be a wolf.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, there's a variety of very, and the further along we get in the late stages of an epoch, the more intense the various attempts to resolve the pressure become, and people hair off in every direction. You see ultra douloi and ultra banausoi, for example, the constant decrying of public morals, is a frustration with the way that douloi just say, well, if the system isn't working for me and I can't understand it, why shouldn't I just be even more of a doulos than I would have been? Why temper my appetites at all if tempering my appetites only leads to misery? Because the system is less and less functional and less serving its members. And you see the same with the 1980s. Greed is good. The ultra rapacious era of Banausoi is another reply. It's like, if this all isn't going to work anyway, and we were barely willing to hold ourselves in check before, well, then we have no reason to hold ourselves in check, and we might as well turn ourselves up to 11 and become the most extreme expressions of our character that we can. And so in this way, it's easier to sort out character types and identify them within the culture at large in the late stages of an epoch than it is in the early stages. In the early stages, we're possessed by a new possibility that's causing us to break away from the past and try to create something new. And it acts as a uniting factor that can, dilute the differences between people to some extent, at least on the surface. But by the time, as you get later and later into an epoch, people begin to become self-caricatures as just in their unwillingness to submerge their character to the larger cultural character. So in the same way, you see the sophists arising in Athens and saying, look, it shouldn't be the good argument that wins. It should be the successful argument that wins. And we'll teach you how to make the bad argument look like the good argument so that you can win. And who cares that strikes at the root of whether, the Greek city-states can be governed effectively? That's not my problem. My problem is, if I teach you this, you'll give me money and I can pay my bills. So why shouldn't I teach you the art of sort of, amoral rhetoric, designed to achieve short-term goals at the cost of long-term consequences? This is the same thing that happens when Solon gives the vote to the Banausoi and arranges for Banausoi from all over the Mediterranean to move into Athens and set up in the Piraeus neighborhood and become, ultra Banausoi with a thalassocracy, a great rule of the sea of traders who ply the Mediterranean. In the short term, it brings a lot of money to Athens and a lot of glorious construction. But in the long term, it strikes at the root of Athens, which is what Thucydides and other commentators at the time actually say, even though they're not sure what the source of the problem is. They can look at somebody like Cleon and say, his behavior is just terrible. Thucydides calls him the most violent of the Athenians. Every time in negotiations, he's always going for, well, let's hurt people. If we hurt people, they'll do what we want. Other people will learn the lesson. And so that's the mafiosi thuggishness that Kenneth Smith is alluding to. When you start getting the might makes right, short-term pragmatic goals are more important than long-term consequences approach to the world. It's a dampening down of the range of possibilities. So let's look at this text. Pull it up here. He starts, the Greeks realized from time immemorial that the liability of any aristocratic order had to consist in the hubris or arrogance to which masterly egos were susceptible. right? I mean, if you are striving to develop your arete, one of the things that's going to happen is you're going to leave other people behind. If it's really your arete and it's a place, Phil's working on art, he's surrounded by people who aren't working on art, and Phil can't help but notice that week by week, he's leaving them behind. He's getting better than they are. So they don't have the gifts in that area. They have gifts in other areas. And so this delta is increasing over time. And you can't help but notice that you're better than other people at whatever that thing is that you're excelling at. And given that we have this liability for hubris built right into the structure of our brain as Homo sapiens, it's inevitable that unless we're very, very careful and diligent about domesticating our ego and making it subservient, it's going to swell. One of the ways that we do that, you see enormous amounts of advice that says, try never to be the smartest guy in the room. Try to surround yourself with smart people so that you always have a sense that there are other people who are as good as you or better than you at things. It's one of the virtues of picking up a craft. You start at the bottom and you're learning from journeymen and masters who are better than you. And it reminds your ego, I'm not a god, I'm a mortal. And I have to climb my way one step at a time, just like anybody else. But the aristocratic order that the Greeks had set up, sure, there's a population of aristoi, and they can look at each other and, try to keep their hubris in check by saying, well, that guy over there, made a better argument than I did last week, so maybe I'm not the king of creation. But meanwhile, they've structured their society so that the douloi and banausoi exist to serve them. All the aristoi have that in common within the social structure of ancient Greece. And even the aristoi who can keep in mind that the reason for an aristos to exist as a role is that you're supposed to serve everybody and try to make a culture that can survive, you can't help but notice that day to day, who it is that's cooking your food and making your clothing and bringing in ivory from Africa and so forth. I mean, it's all of these people that you look down on, and so there is a susceptibility to hubris built into the social structure, the class structure of ancient Greece. And the Greeks saw that as a problem. So to this end, he says their culture counterposed myths, fables, epics, and tragic dramas. Tales not just of Icarus and Prometheus, but of the hare, Achilles, and Oedipus that cautioned against self-infatuation. Sort of a relentless tide of literature and stories that people are telling each other, all the time. They're telling them at the Olympics. They're telling them at the other 3 annual festival, competitive festivals. They're telling them in their homes. Everywhere they go, they're trying to surround themselves with stories to warn against self-infatuation. And then he says, but such a moral regimen was only of value where indeed true aristoi sought to constrain themselves by means of piety and reason. The 2 lower castes, douloi and banausoi, lived and thought every day of their lives in pursuit of hubristic forces. And I'll do the rest of the sentence later, but that's the point right there. That's we're dealing at this moment in history when Solon has given the vote to the banausoi. And the banausoi live their entire lives driven by and not in any way leashing their hubris, right? The trader who thinks the most boldly and sets out on the greatest expedition and manages the greatest exchange and trade to brings is the one who brings back the wealth to Athens. The timid don't, right? I mean, there's a lot of risks taking your boat upon the sea, as the god Poseidon is relentlessly warning. As that's why they have that god. It's not the friendly sea, it's the sea of changeable temperament. So this encourages the what do I want to say, the reinforcement, the strengthening of hubris rather than the leashing of hubris. So you give those people the vote, which Solon did, and what happens politically in Athens is that a bunch of timid, cautious, self-criticizing people have trouble restraining the boundless enthusiasm of a bunch of self-aggrandizing people. There is a way in which, as Kenneth likes to say, con artistry becomes a major player in politics. And when you've got this generation of sub-philosophical sophists running around teaching the banausoi how to make their bad arguments sound like good arguments, then a certain percentage of the time they're going to fool the aristoi. because now they're wielding the tools of rhetoric that previously were kept to just the eristic class. What we see is a fragility in the class system in Athens, right? They were relying on ignorance of rhetoric to prevent the Banausoi from being so persuasive. And they were relying on the Banausoi not having a vote to make it irrelevant what their opinions were. But you give them the vote and you give them the powers of rhetoric, and all of a sudden the whole system of heuristic decision-making begins to crumble. The rest of the sentence concludes, natural and psychic appetites, acquisitive materialism, and aggrandizing profiteering, none of which respects the sanctity of inherent limits. And he puts in parens nothing to excess, which of course is one of the statements on carved into the lintel on the upright stone at the oracle at Delphi, and that they carved over and over in the stones they stood up throughout later would stand up throughout the Hellenistic period all over the Alexandrian Empire. Medin agan, nothing to excess. Only Aristoi appreciate the import of the Greek virtue that equates wisdom with moderation, sophrosune. All other castes require to be moderated from some source outside themselves. So the old system allowed the Aristoi to keep the Douloi and Banausoi in check, since they lacked sophrosune and the Aristoi, in theory, had it. Not always in practice, as Greek history teaches us, but at least it was something that they strove for. But the Douloi and Banausoi never strove for that. They didn't see moderation as any kind of wisdom. And of course, sophrosune, Kenneth is using the translation he's using here for sophrosune is the one that Wheelwright uses, where temperance and moderation are seen as the translations of phronesis and sophrosune. But other people, other translators, will sometimes translate this as practical intelligence, which is even less clear that its relevance to the problem that we're talking about. What we've been talking about for the last month is we've been throwing the term self-providence around as a gross approximation in English, which doesn't have a word for this, of the most important central term in the ancient Greek world. As Heraclitus says, the greatest of the arites is phronesis. And that arete is that thing that every animal but us has, which is an awareness of, an interest in, and a pursuit of the things, the activities in life that make that species succeed in harmony with the rest of nature. The longing of the cheetah to unite itself with the gazelle, right, is an example of that. The mimicry of birds that mimic other birds. Whatever it is, whatever their arete is, they're obsessed with it. They're focused on it. They can't stop thinking about it. When migration time comes, the Canada geese have to go. They have to. They can't stop thinking about it. This phronesis, this sophrosune, keeps all of these species in harmony within the ecosystem, and it's in its violent, gross, rough way, but it does it. Whereas Homo sapiens lacks sophrosune. There's nothing to hold us in check. We're just as likely to destroy ourselves, maybe more likely to destroy ourselves than to succeed, unless we can compensate for this absence with our culture, so that the culture teaches people to value sophrosune. And what he's saying in this paragraph is that the way that the ancient Greeks constructed their culture, it seemed to them that there were three different types of character in people, and only one of them was receptive to the idea of sophrosune. And that's the definition of the Aristoi. This is the people who go through the multiple stages of development that lead to the mature adult mind, according to Aristotle. The other two types of character in Homo sapiens, they stop developing at a certain stage. The Douloi at the experiential stage, and the Banausoi at the intellectual rationalizing stage. And the consequences for that is that they're incapable of sophrosune, and they're a danger to everybody around them, according to the Greek view of the world. So this is what he's talking about here. This is, in some ways, this paragraph is a summation of everything that's come before in chapter 4. In another way, it can only really be understood if we've already read chapter 4 and had the discussions that we've had to really piece apart, what is he talking about here? What are the Greeks concerned with here? And why would they see that failure to heed sophrosune as the critical turning point in the ongoing collapse of the ancient worldview. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. Oh, you're still on mute.
It seems like, from what you're describing, in some sense, in modern terms, it's a relationship between hard power and soft power. And I begin to wonder, if it's so, why do you need sophistry at all? Because you just bash the philosopher around and take over, or you bash a sophist around and take over. So there must be a recognition at that point that, in a sense, that people have minds, or some form of mind. Let's not quite call it mind, but some sort of thinking. So even people who believe in hard power, like, I'm going to beat you up if you don't shut up, still have to somehow maneuver in relationship to thinking and winning arguments and all that sort of thing. So that's why they need sophistry. But does that really work? Because, like, that I'm thinking of Lenin, power comes at the end of the gun, not the end of the pen. The pen, supposedly the pen is mightier than the sword. Oh, I don't think so. Or maybe mightier than the sword, but not a barrel of a gun. So how does that work, that relationship between soft power and hard power? I mean, the soft power people, hey, let's talk about this. Let's talk it over. And you throw the table up and say, no, I don't want to talk about it. I just want to beat you up. That's it. That's the end of the argument, unless you come up with, a bazooka. They say, well, maybe it's time to talk about it. So how does that work? I mean, it does seem like that even if you believe in hard power, I mean, the body over the mind, in a sense, somehow you've been lured into thinking, no, that's not the end of the argument. Somehow you got drawn into the conference room and talk about it. So is that a decisive moment in Greek history? Because before that, they just go, oh, let's go and destroy Troy. I mean, they violated all principles. That's it. Let's do it. And and I think the Trojans tried to talk to them about it. Maybe they should have gave him Paris and Helen, and that will settle the thing. But it's like, yeah. So was that superior that they went on without, like, let's not argue about it. Let's just go and defeat these people. We got 1,000 ships. Like, I'm not sure which is a superior system in a way. Like you would say in the old days, we live in our, I guess, in our emotions and our power, and it's like, yeah, we got 1,000 ships. Why even bother talking? So could you say something about that, the relationship between hard power and soft power, which seemed to me was still in that relationship? That's it. I just thought, and why the hell do we need the sophists? Because they're just mediating the argument, like, if I'm going to go bash you in, I'm going to bring like what is this, a Shep machine gun, and I put it on the table like this. Any objections? No.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And what you're seeing here with the rise of the sophists in Athens is a transitional stage in the rise of the corruption. Right? This is the stage where, in order to seize power, they have to start by mimicking those who run the existing order. They can't just take power yet because they don't have it. The other side has it. And they're working their way up step by step to getting there. And they begin with mimesis. That's what essentially sophistry is like the current generation of AI. It has no idea what it's doing, but it knows how to imitate the patterns. And that's why the current generation is often called plagiarism software. So this is what the sophists, what the Banausoi are doing when they learn how to ape the outward forms of convincing principle-based dialogue, and then they use it to satisfy their own appetites. So the difference is wherein Aristos is trying to speak from the heart and be as authentic and alive word by word as they can in Athens at the time, the sophist is doing the exact opposite. They couldn't be more distanced from the words that they're deploying. The words are not what they mean at all. The words are what they think they have to deploy in order to achieve their objectives. And so there's a level of dishonesty, of negation internally built into the relationship between the words and the thoughts and so forth. And all of that, it's the same way in which, animals that hunt by mimesis do the exact same thing that the sophist is doing in Athens, which is, hey, I'm one of you. You can trust me. And it's what the con artist does. Hey, good news. This is a game you can't possibly lose. Just put your butt down on the table, and isn't this going to be great? Oh, surprise, you lost. Who could have foreseen that?
Let me ask you a question, Dad, because it's always curious in a sense, going back to Lenin and other revolutions actually, is those damn people in the middle class. Like I mean, the proletariat. I don't think the proletariat could arise or even want to. It's the middle class that rip them up, and say, because I guess some of them went to university and learn a few tricks and argue. So, we think, I guess, in terms of Marxism, I don't know that well enough, but it seems like the working class is the real essence, but in some sense they need the middle class to deal with the arguments and rally the troops in a way. So are we in danger, at least in America, of losing our middle class? Therefore, I mean, how does that work? I mean, it seems like the middle class, at least in a democratic, slash capitalist system, is needed to, in a funny way, to suppress the situation rather than rally the working class in some sense. And now they're gone. It's like, and maybe that's a different order structure. I don't know how that works in relationship to, capital and Marx in a way. So yeah, the middle class seems like a linchpin of some sort. And I'm sure that in some sense there is a middle class in a way. That probably would be the trading people in Athens, I imagine,
So in modernity, the emergence of a middle class fed the promise
Mhm.
of the modern order. And the promise of the modern order is anybody could win. You just have to work hard and be smart and do a good job, and you'll climb. And as long as there was a middle class, the lower class could watch people climb their way up into the middle class and say, this dream must be true. This promise must be real. I know too many people who've done it to believe that it's impossible. So I'm willing to commit myself to the promise of the modern epoch because maybe I could do it too. But what happens in the late stage, in the transition from Greece to Rome, and what we see happening now is the shift from soft power to hard power, which is we stop trying to seduce you with the promise of the epoch, and we start saying, well, we feel confident and strong enough now that we don't feel any need for those ladders. We don't need to give you a chance to climb. We'll just tell you to obey, and if you don't, we'll punish you. It becomes more and more the naked fist. Takes the glove off, doesn't even pretend that it's going to be soft, and just says, obey because I can force you to, and you wouldn't like that, so do what I say. These are some of the speeches that Thucydides carefully documents in the history of the Peloponnesian War, and he's doing it because his audience is horrified that those words aren't coming out of the mouth of some of the representatives of some other city-state. They're coming out of the mouths of the Athenians, who are saying, surrender, or we're going to do horrific things to you. And it won't be nice when you surrender. We will do bad things to you. But if you don't surrender, we're just going to exterminate you. And you wouldn't want that. That's like mafia talk, right? Pay up, or we're going to break your kneecaps. This is what the Athenian representatives are saying. And Thucydides is horrified, but he's documenting it very carefully, because he's saying we're seeing the shift from soft power to hard power. And of course, part of the reason that Cornford says we're seeing that shift, which Thucydides didn't appreciate at the time, is because the people who are speaking are not aristoi, they're banausoi. They're the new emergent powerful merchant class, and they're used to, either you pay up or you don't pay up. And if you don't pay up, you don't get the goods. And if you do pay up, you do. The law of the excluded middle is central to trade and money. And people think in those terms. And so it becomes natural to say, look, if I have a goal, I will accomplish it by any means. And I might try soft power, but if that doesn't work, I'll shift to hard power, because what's most important to me is to get what I want. They think in those practical terms. And of course, practicality is just another word for brutality. It's I'm not going to think about restraining myself. I'm just going to figure out how to get the things that I want. So the soft power, hard power discussion you're having, part of what we're seeing then in that is a transition over time. It's not that there wasn't hard power earlier, but that previously they tried to align hard power to soft power in such a way that when you deployed hard power, all the other people would look around and say, well, I mean, it makes sense why he would do that. There really wasn't another option. They tried all the other choices. But by the time you get late into the epoch, they start taking off the glove, and now it's just straight up hard power. And that's the stage at the early parts of which those in power feel the most confident. But the stupid thing is, every time they act, they're undermining their own system. Everybody else is losing confidence, not only in them, but in the entire prospect of the current epoch and its promise. They're accelerating the rot of their own system without understanding that that's what they're doing, because they've forgotten that the soft power is more important than the hard power. If you don't have the soft power, your epoch is coming to an end. It's the clock is ticking.
Well, the soft power relies on, I guess, something called trust. You know what I mean? Like, because if you don't trust what the guy says, you're not gonna believe it. You will rebel if you can, but if you can't, I guess it comes down to the hard power. So if there's no trust, then it becomes a problem, because he's just talking, man. Like in some sense, I guess that's what it means. Okay, I'll leave it there and continue.
Thanks for bringing it up. And this goes to the heart of what Aristotle's talking about in the Athenian Constitution when he talks about the different forms of government. The three different forms of government that come in: the bad flavor and the good flavor. The difference between the bad and the good flavor is sophrosune. Whether it's the one or the few or the many who are governing, do they have sophrosune? Do they understand that they exist to serve the population and the deeper principles of life that make some civilizations thrive and others fail? Do they get that? Do they know that they have to submit their own egos to the discipline of harmonizing with these deeper principles and being of service? If they get it, then it's the good form of the government. And if they don't get it, then it's the bad form of the government. The democracy is not inherently good. It all depends on the makeup of the people voting. If you have a bunch of thugs voting, like was happening with the Banausoi and the Piraeus, then you get mob behavior, which is what we see in the negotiations with the city-state before Athens tears it to pieces. If you have, a population that's made up of, people who possess sophrosune, or I say possess, but what we really mean is who value and commit themselves to the quest to try to develop sophrosune in themselves. If that's what you've got, then they're going to make a lot fewer mistakes, and they're going to be a lot less like might makes right. So basically, what he's saying is, in a sense, there is this, when you learn to stop seeing the world as made up of Legos or objects or things the way we do, when you get past that, you start to recover the way that the ancients saw the world as made up of organisms. And each organism has its own sense of what the world is like and what it's like, and its own desires and teleology and its own drives to unfold itself. When you understand that, you come to realize that the problem of government is vastly more complex than simple-minded people like moderns can possibly understand. Well, we want it to be snap the Legos together, and if they don't obey, hit them with the hammer. You know, we think like the Romans do. We think like thugs. You know, throw him in jail. He was bad. This is the sum total of our wisdom, such as it is. But the ancients understand that government is vastly more complex than that, and that the only way you can succeed is if everybody is working on it together. And the way they work on it together is that every single person who has a say has to be cultivating their own sophrosune to govern themselves. If they don't govern themselves, at least to a large extent, then it doesn't matter what form of government you adopt. I mean, you want a kingship, you want an aristocracy, you want a democracy. None of these solves the problem that if the decision makers don't care about sophrosune, they're going to screw it up. Right? Governance has to be a cooperative venture. We all have to be working on it together, working on our pieces of it. Even in a kingship where only one guy is calling the shots, you think, well, how much more authoritarian can you get? But Aristotle says, even in that context, it only works if every other person in the society is also trying to cultivate sophrosune and trying to govern themselves and each other. That's the only way that the king can pull it off. The idea of ultimate power is a fallacy. The dream of being the biggest hammer that can hit any nail is the dream of a thug. It can't possibly work. So this is the hard power, soft power problem. When people resort to hard power, they've shifted to the stage of civilization at which they've convinced themselves that governance isn't that hard after all. And all you need is a big enough rock to hit the other guy with, and he'll do what you want. And at that point, you're incapable of governance. The people in charge are far too idiotic. Their intelligence works against them. You're existing in a state of tragic inversion where, you know, no matter how good their intentions or how much education they have or anything else, it's all going to work against them and against society because they are not appreciating the full prospect of the problem, you know, before them. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So that question of getting ahead in life. Well, in our own time, there was, in our younger days, there was that very strong feeling that if you played your cards right, you would succeed. And there was a sense of conservatism at the time connected with that. Now, we had the run up to the GFC, and in the GFC, what the investment banks did is they turned American Insurance Group into the bad bank. All the investment banks got virtually bets that were guaranteed their bottom line, even if things collapsed, and they collapsed. Therefore, American Insurance Group was sinking, and who was going to take the bad bank? Who else but the taxpayer? So the message is for the big and powerful, if we win, we win. If we lose, we win. For the public, it's a different message. And I was expecting a Great Depression. I could see it coming along back in 2003. At the same time, the market was screaming, 99% of the market was screaming, this is a new paradigm. We don't have depressions anymore. That's history. And then, you know, the collapse came, and I had thoughts that, you know, if Obama got in, he'd put a stop to it. And he just goes to the meeting, yep, signs the checks, yeah. Can I do anything else for you? And I sort of lost interest in it. You know, there was just too much hard work, too much time was spent looking at the investment market and all these issues. I did learn a lot at the time. But I thought, I was expecting a Great Depression, and yeah, they used a system to get around it, a new system in a sense. And I thought, well, will there be consequences to this? And I didn't really take great notice. You had the Wall Street protests where the public was saying, hey, if you can give the big end of town handouts, where's ours? And unfortunately, you can't give handouts to everybody. You can give handouts to a certain group of people, but not everybody. And so that was the price, that now they've got a sort of public ill discipline. The public's not happy. And in those few years, people had thought, well, if I go to do tertiary study, it's a guaranteed meal ticket. It always was. There used to be a case when tertiary study was rarer, that even doing it and dropping out was still a good meal ticket. Now you had to succeed. That was a good meal ticket. Today, people began to notice they've spent all this money on going to university, and they're walking out the turnstiles and getting nothing. This slowly ticked over, and, following the GFC, people still saying, oh, surely I go to do tertiary study. There's my meal ticket. Oh, sorry, you spent all this money. Sorry, no meal ticket. So the world for the Anglo-Saxon has turned. This malaise hits continental Europe a lot longer, back in the 70s. Continental Europe never really got out of the 70s malaise. The Anglo-Saxon world did, because we got Asia to work for us. We borrowed money from Asia, and the world changed greatly. Thank you.
Hey, Stephen, the students that got the degrees, they didn't get nothing. They got a lot of debt.
They got a negative.
That's right.
Yeah, that's and that's part of what we see late in the epoch. Early in the epoch, in any epoch, the new order that's trying to emerge doesn't have its footing under it solidly yet. It's still pushing off against the old order, which has all the wealth and power. And the only way it can survive is if it helps as many people as possible to stand on their feet and join the movement to replace the old order. And so you see that in the early stages of Christianity, well, the early stages of medieval Christianity, not the early stages of Christianity. You see it in the early stages of the modern epoch. There's this strong sense of we can all do it together. We're all going to support each other. And presumably something like that happened in the early stages of the ancient epoch. We don't know, because it's lost to an illiterate stage when we don't, it's not documented. But certainly one of the signs that you've left the middle thriving period, the Fluoruit, as the Greeks and Romans used to say, and you've moved on to the late stage of an epoch, is all the ladders start being pulled up. People start disassembling all the means by which the majority can grow and thrive, because they're shifting to hard power. They're overconfident now. They don't think they need the consent of the governed. And without the consent of the governed, it's only a matter of time before they drive a stake into your heart. But they don't believe, even though it's happened over and over throughout history, they think they'll be the exception, because we're so much stronger than the previous epoch. We couldn't possibly fall prey to the same thing that everybody who ever did what we did in the history of the world has fallen prey to. So you see that now, where even education has become a scam, in which what was supposed to get you out of the starting gate and into life instead moves you miles behind the starting gate. You have to work for decades just to get to zero. Which is a horrific thing to do to your own children, but that's the way we structure society now. And it's a sign. It's one of the many signs that we're in the late stage. This is people are always predicting the end of the world, but this is the difference between just opinionating and shooting our mouths off on the one hand, versus what Kenneth and the existentialists are trying to do, which is anatomizing the structure of human character, human societies, human cultures, and epochs of civilizations. How does this all put together? How is it structured? What are the life cycles that they go through? And once you do that, you can sort of see the evidence everywhere that, we're in the loot and pillage stage, and we have been for decades. I can see it myself, even on the small scale. I mean, I was lucky. I was from like the last stage or two where there were still some ladders that hadn't been pulled up and you could get on them and climb your way into a career. I started out at minimum wage in Walla Walla, Washington, and climbed my way up to being one of the senior programmers, software engineers in the Department of Veterans Affairs. And I could do that in 1984. I could start that climb. You can't do it today. It's gone. They don't have those summer aid, student aid programs that gradually, step by step, get you to doing what I did. They're all gone. And the amount that I paid for college back then was it was laughable compared to what people pay now, where they indebt themselves for the rest of their working career just to get an education. It's nuts. But it's the particular kind of nuts. It's not a random nuts. It's the nuts of an overconfident system that thinks it no longer needs the consent of the governed. So it might as well rip them all off. Given what Stephen was saying, I just want to throw a link in there to the film My Man Godfrey, which is a highly entertaining film, and it's got some fun acting in it. It's hilarious. It's comedy ostensibly, but it's set during the Great Depression. And it's an expose on the different possible forms of behavior that the rich could have to the Depression. And what we see throughout most of the film is the ultra rich are living lives, escapist lives, in which they just don't even notice poor people or think about them, even though almost everybody's poor at the time. And our protagonist, Godfrey, is a good example of that. And I won't give away the ending for those who haven't seen it before, but it's really entertaining and interesting. And what you come to realize is it's actually a critique of a society in which some of the people have begun to believe that they don't need the consent of the governed, and we're not all in this together. It's okay to just rip people off and live isolated lives of privilege. It's one of the we've been playing this game for more than just the last few decades. 20th century was one of the periods that really shook up people's confidence in modernity and its prospects. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, a year, 2 year, I don't know when it was, you were talking to us a lot about Hannah Arendt and between past and future. And there's an essay in there, What is Authority? Which is, now I think it must be, people would read it. It's be comical, but it's on this question that authority has no need of violence because the authoritative person does such a bang up job at whatever it is they're doing that people just want to go with it, real authority that not veiled hard power pretending to be soft power. And of course, now we wouldn't use the word authority in that way. An authoritarian regime would be one that primarily relied on hard power, not soft power. Authoritarian, I think for Arendt, there was a regime that's so good, everybody's happy. We're being well governed. We have the real authorities are ruling us, and that reminds me about the only scene I can really remember from Game of Thrones. There's some young lady who thinks she's really smart, and she tells, I think the Lena Headey character, you won't kill me. Knowledge is power, and I know things. And the response was, guard, seize this woman and kill her. And then she stops him and she says, power is power. Knowledge is nothing. you can live today, but just remember this lesson, not, and that's sort of the where we've come to the inversion. There is something we've been talking about who overthrow whom and whatever, and some references to Lenin. Well, I've been reading this book. It's taken me too long, by Timothy Snyder on stuff that happened between the Soviets and Ukraine and Germany and a lot of other things. And one of the things that surprised me was that the Soviet view of the proletariat was the industrial worker. It was somebody who was totally dependent. And the owner, by taking ownership of the industry, they I don't know what they did, but it didn't really change the status of the worker. But so the bourgeois had to be gotten out of the way because they had the ownership of the industries and the wealthy. But there was another class that had to be attacked, and that was the independent farmer. Not that they were rich, not that they had money or engaged in trade or banking or anything like that, but because they didn't need the government. They didn't work for someone else. And they had to be killed by the millions. And agriculture, a profession that normally close to nature, sort of as good as we currently get, had to be gotten rid of because it was self-sufficient. A farmer and land was an enemy of the state. And I'd never quite appreciated, not from reading Marx, I never caught that you would think the farmer would be somebody whose labor is not alienated, not enemy of the state. Anyway, so maybe we gotta, I don't know, all this stuff. We got a lot to go here. I won't slow us down any.
No, but those are excellent points. And so I'll save the modern stuff for later. But I definitely want to point anybody who has not read What is Authority in Hannah Arendt's, Between Past and Future. You really should. Donald's right. You really should read it. It's incredibly potent. And it's incredibly enlightening because our modern conception of authority is so corrupted that, like Donald says, we use the word authoritarian for somebody who has no authority at all, but just uses coercion. And she makes clear the distinction between coercion and authority. And someone with authority doesn't have to force you to do anything. The nature of authority, the genuine authority, real authority, she says, is a power in Homo sapiens. It's built into the character of our species that we feel the presence of genuine authority, and we long to align ourselves with it and harmonize ourselves with it. It's like a student in a dojo sees the black belt do something wonderful, and you want to emulate, not because he's going to hit you or because he's going to punish you in some way, but because, oh my God, I can't do that half so well. I want to become that person. I want to learn to do that thing. And I can only do it if I emulate them and follow them and be like them. And this goes back to what Donald said before about Kenneth's line is, if you want to understand an Aristos, you have to follow one around, because there's no substitute for that swelling of authority within you, the recognition of their genuine authority. So this is Hannah Arendt. And I can't remember is it in Between Past and Future, or is it in
I think it's collected in past and future.
Yeah.
I had to go buy a new copy of that book for you. You cited some essay that was not in my early edition.
The early edition only has 6 chapters and the later
Yeah.
one 8. Yeah.
And I would say about some of this, my repeated observation from Plato's Republic, where are we going to find all these philosopher plumbers? I mean, Kenneth is right here. How do you get the Douloi and the Banausoi to realize they make a valuable contribution to the polis, but they can't rule it. And they have to willingly not rule it. They have to, oh, maybe Nietzsche would say that. You have to will not to rule, to will not to exercise power. What do you think of that, Stephen? You like Nietzsche?
Let me just double check that this is right, that this is the one. Because boy, this discussion of authority is highly relevant to the difference between moderns and ancients. I've put a link to the Internet Archive. Oh yeah, it's chapter 3. Yes, chapter 3. What is sorry, I said what is the authority? It's what is authority. Everybody should read that. Hi, Socrates Cafe. Good to see you again. So yeah, Hannah Arendt talking about authority really puts her finger on one of the critical differences between the modern world and the ancient world. In the modern world, we think authority comes from the consent of the governed, but not in a direct way. We think it comes through voting and buying and other forms of mediated systems of enumeration. And the thing about real authority is it doesn't involve enumeration. I mean, I've been working for more than 50 years on trying to specify the different stages of development in traditional Okinawan martial arts. And they're extraordinarily hard to write down in any kind of way that you can measure. But it's very easy to recognize it when you see it, if you've been immersed in it. So there is a qualitative, experiential aspect to authority that is that's missing from all of these ersatz substitutes that we create in the modern world. So, you know, part of what we see with the Banausoi in the Piraeus outvoting, becoming this voting bloc that starts to pull the Aristoi out of the true in the Peloponnesian War, is that we're seeing the substitution of fake authority in a modern, what moderns consider to be authority. We're seeing that substituting for genuine authority. And it's because, as Donald says, you know, the Douloi and Banausoi have no real capacity to recognize authority. So they have no sophrosune. They can't distinguish their desire to conquer Syracuse and Carthage and become trade masters of the Mediterranean. They can't distinguish that from genuine health. They think getting what they want is healthy and having more money is healthy. To them, in fact, if anything, this sophrosune stuff doesn't, it's all fuzzy, wuzzy, vague stuff. They don't understand what it is or how to measure it. They don't really believe in it. They understand you have to say it. And so they learn how to say it, you know, through their training by the sophists. And that's how they win their votes. But they don't believe in it. They, you know, they believe in a percentage and conquest. And that's what they drag Athens into doing. And it leads to the downfall of Athens. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Hey guys, I don't think I've ever spoken here before. So to start, I just want to first say thank you. And I deeply appreciate you as human beings and interacting with actual human beings for the sake of this, being with you, participating, contributing. This is what's best in life. So I'm very grateful. Next, I wanted to see, I have we talked about this last week about sort of including different points of view of mythology or ideology, whatever you want to use language, and seeing from the Eastern and the Western, and all these things give us a little bit of focus on a certain type of picture we're looking at. But when you can use multiple lenses, you can get more zoom in and out. I'm kind of rephrasing in my own language, right? And things become more clear when you have different angles of approach. So I like to bring different angles of approach. Something I've been reading is a little more modern. It's by one of my favorite philosophers. She's not really recognized as a philosopher. You may have heard of her, is Dana Meadows. She is a pioneer along with, I forget her husband, it's Jeffrey something or other. But they have the Institute of Systems, and her famous book is called Thinking in Systems. And really, I wanted to think about this, at least when we're talking about hard power and soft power, or we use the consent of the governed. The consent of the governed is what I imagine in each and every person, what they're experiencing, and whether that is, good. And if they think it's good, then they'll give their consent to the government. And this is idea of each one of these people acting like an individual nerve or information unit that then transmits that to some sort of body like the state, and then the body will then determine like, oh yeah, we got all the votes we need, everybody loves what we're doing. So if it's like the policies were like, we're going to kill all the trees in the world, just make that up, and everybody votes yay yay yay, then we're like, oh well, this matches up, they want it, so we're going to do it, right? And so this is this relationship between the consent of the governed is what we call a bottom up system. It's where you get a flow of information that's independent from each other, and they're all universally experiencing the same top-down system, which will be the rules or the laws that's provided by the decision makers at the top. And it's interesting that you brought into the idea of, I didn't even think about this so much, it's almost a tangent for me, this idea of the wealthy living escapist lives. The people with real power now are using this power to just check out and like have vacation lifestyles. Very childish, very strange behavior if you're looking at our modern society. Like the wealthiest, most powerful people are not the people with the most information. They're oftentimes the less developed emotionally. I mean, I think Trump is a perfect example here. He behaves like a toddler emotionally. He says something he doesn't like and he just rages about it. I mean, I don't know if you saw my kids running through here, but I see that like this sort of gut response to things and just getting really activated and upset or emotional, however what that is. That's just a signature of an underdeveloped mind or an underdeveloped system. And you can see that that actually matches up very perfectly with politically. In this case, Trump is a perfect example for leadership in our time because most people can't tolerate discomfort. They can't hold two disparate ideas together and sort of connect them and have tension between them. This is what relationships are all about. So what is this tension? Except in the brain, similarly with the body, the brain, we use words and language to create rules for expectations, i.e., like I'm going to give a handout to everybody, right? And then if everybody gets that handout and they're happy, then you know it worked. So it's like if this bottom up, top down, when they match each other, this is when you have what you're talking about, the early part of an epoch, where you have in the earlier part where there's a good matching between the system of mythology, perhaps the Christian era, right? When this vacuum of rules or society or expectations about a shared future. This is more speaking of I'm gonna try to tell you my references, at least in my own mind as I'm thinking of. This is the angle approach by someone named Yuval Harari. He's an anthropologist, and he wrote a book called Sapiens. But it describes how we humans we live in a shared world of imagination, and imagination is described as like something that has no physicality. It's there's no physical at all, like meaning in this case of an object. If you have a certain rock or a certain thing, when you attach meaning to it, then that's because you have some imaginary idea. And the more we can have shared universal imaginary ideas, that leads to cooperation. You were talking about this cooperative nature, because we all can believe in a shared future where my participation in that shared future matches up with my experience of reality. And this happens when you have this matching up between a top down. Thank you, Rick. That's the book. I've read that book so many times. I love it. He talks about this nature of pretty much culture being kind of like a non-conspiratorial version of culture, where there's this like system of beliefs that are fixed and they provide descriptions of reality. And we use this description of reality to predict the future. And we do this through imagination. And if we all kind of have the same imagination together, then we can have this, which forms a bottom up system where we're all on board. So it's like if we're all recognizing something like Pearl Harbor happened, and that's a universal experience, that the news is a singular set of news instead of like today, like someone will be like, Pearl Harbor didn't happen, or oh, it was actually the Russians, not the Japanese. But like we had a single experience of what that news was said to us in terms of a top-down information system, and that meant we were at war. And then everybody feels on their own heart like, oh, I need to go to war because this is happening and America's under what, because that created a shared universal experience that matched up to the singular set of information or rules about expectations about what we're doing and why we're doing this, when those things match up, you have cooperation, and you have what I call, in this case, emergent properties of cooperation, which is basically in economics or in other places referred to as surplus or like exponential growth. But you have real growth when things can happen, when these systems can interact with each other in a cooperative way. It's kind of like a clock, really setting the time well. And if the time that's predicted matches up to the time that's experienced, then you have usually that for people that feels good. So I hear that the hardness of power really reflects the singular nature of an authority. In this case, authority is just a top-down presentation. So I like this too. The real authority is someone who can demonstrate some sort of set of ideas that are easily or relatively easily followable. You know, you can follow this path of your sergeant or your general, and it's going to lead you to victory. And if it gets everybody killed, you're like, oh, that's not authority. But if he's successful, then he's like, oh, he was authority, right? And so this is where I see the hard power is really a reflection of a top-down system, and the better the top-down system is, the more it matches up to the bottom. And the secret to this, it's interesting, we kind of go around this, is as I buy into this mythology of Harari, again, I realize I'm smuggling in my own baggage, but it's like we could create any imaginary system we wanted, and if that matches up to our experience of reality, we're good to go. It could be anything. And I think I'll stop there. There's a good lot of food for the table for everybody to get some buffet action.
That's
Thanks.
great, Ari. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm having trouble muting myself. If you mind, I have children come in, and my devices are different, and it's weird. I can't find. There it is.
Excellent. Yeah, so part of what we're doing with what you're talking about and kind of how that relates to what we've been discussing, is we're exploring this issue of, as moderns, all of our words and concepts have a certain modernist framework that we take for granted, and it's hard for us to examine. But if we look deeply enough at the ancient worldview, we can come to understand that those words and concepts meant something radically different to them than they mean to us. And in fact, in many cases, it's not translatable at all, because any attempt to translate those ideas into modern English turn them into modern concepts that not only in some cases are off the mark from the ancient ideas, but in some cases they're the exact opposite of those ideas. So like what you're talking about, top down and bottom up, these are attempts in kind of the late stage of modernity to find ways to reconstruct the missing concepts of authority. To the Greeks, it was well understood that you couldn't govern without the consent of the governed. And one of the ways that you see that is actually in the Peloponnesian War. I mean, God, that book is just so helpful in so many ways. But I mean, one of the dominant strategies that Athens uses against Sparta is that they just keep dropping onto the Spartan coast and inciting slave revolts, because Sparta is a house of cards. For all that we worship them now as the pinnacle of toughness and masculinity, the truth is it was a house of cards, and they knew it, and they said it. And an enormous part of Athens's campaign against Sparta consisted of getting their own slaves to attack them, because the ratio of free people to slaves was so extreme in Sparta that there were barely enough free people to sort of hold the whole thing together if it didn't get jostled. But the first wind that comes along, and whole sections of the Peloponnese are breaking free from the Spartan government, because the Spartans really couldn't hold on to them to start with. They were trying, the Athenian critique was that the Spartans were trying to rule without the consent of the governed, by using terror, by terrorizing the helots so that they'd be cowed. And the result was a house of cards. And the fact that Sparta beat Athens in the Peloponnesian War, it's not supposed to be saying that the top-down approach is the right approach, and if only we could all be thugs, then then we'd have a peaceful world. It's the opposite. Thucydides' argument is, look how rotten Athens has become, that even this house of cards could push Athens over and defeat them. But it's lost on us because we don't understand this stuff about the consent of the governed and so forth. The Athenians could put themselves under intense hardships without a revolt, because they basically agreed on the direction that they were going, and they were willing to suffer together. But The Spartans did not agree because most of them were not free and most of them hated what was happening to them. And given the first chance, they throw them off. So in Sparta, the fragility that we see, in the same way that the sophists are foreshadowing of the mafiosi style Roman Empire to come, so too the Spartan house of cards that's militarily powerful, seemingly, but always on the edge of falling apart because it lacks the consent of the governed. That's another way in which we're foreshadowing the late Roman Empire, which is why, in the end of the Roman Empire is everyone decides to stop fighting for it. Why bother? It's so rotten and corrupt. The barbarism is surely an improvement, from the average person who's tired of the Roman yoke. It's a theme I come back to over and over, and I come back to it because there are a lot of people talking that way today about the modern world. And in many stages of the modern world, you had enormous buy-in. But as things get more rotten and corrupt, the buy-in begins to go lower and lower and lower, and that's the blood running out of the system. So authority, right? These are these issues of what does authority mean? How can you govern the world in a meaningful way? These are things that are go right to the heart of the radically different way in which the ancient world saw things compared to the modern world. And sophistry, as it emerges around the time of the Peloponnesian War in Athens, is the betrayal of the fundamental value proposition of the ancient world order. It's saying, who cares who wins an argument? It should be whoever can, fool people. That's who should win an argument. So there's a what do we want to say? A pseudophilia is spreading throughout Athenian culture, and the consequences of that are seen in the Peloponnesian War. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm going to start out with something that happened in this meetup maybe about a year ago, but I'm only using that as a transition to this thing about authority. I remember at the end of the discussion, Jenny said something very nice about you. He said, "Oh, you're such an authority and all this stuff." And I kind of shook my head, and I think you were a little bit miffed, okay? And I explained, well, you're the least authoritarian person that I know. That was my answer, okay? So that was a political answer rather than a humanistic answer. And I want to use that as a transition to Nelson Mandela. I once asked an African friend who's a very smart guy, who's really into politics quite a bit. And he's a native of Africa, so he's not an American African. And I asked him, what is it that made Nelson Mandela succeed when Stephen Biko was beaten to death? I like both of them, by the way, although I admire Nelson Mandela a lot more because he actually succeeded. And his answer was, well, when he was put in prison, the government was responsible for his life. And so therefore they couldn't kill him. Although Stephen Biko was beaten to death, I think, in prison. So I think he got it partially right. My thought about this, and I thought about this, is that Nelson Mandela began as a revolutionary, and I think in many ways indistinguishable from Stephen Biko. But when he went to prison, I think he changed. He began to realize it was a political situation that, in a sense, transcended something that covered over the opposition were also made of human beings. And he got along with his prison guards. They all admire him and they liked him, despite the fact they were at different things. And I think that what made him different, that he was able to transcend the political to come back to the political in a different way. And in some ways, open up the possibility of, let's say, trying to heal the wounds that was in South Africa. I mean, for instance, when he was putting up, when he was, I think he was putting together the South African rugby team. He was very instrumental in making sure that the white players and the black players worked together. And that was a very, very interesting movement. And I think that ability to transcend something that in some sense creates a divide in the politics into something that beneath the politics were human beings. And if you saw that and treated the humanism in the right way, I think you could transcend it. I think that's what made him succeed. And I think Stephen Biko never had the chance to recognize that. He always saw the opposite as the enemy that we had to fight for. So you want to fight? Well, okay, we'll fight. We'll beat you to death. And so I think that says something about authority, because he was able to command authority to people as human beings over the fact that they were, whites that was trying to govern South Africa in a divisive way. And he was able to transcend that. That's my belief, the different concept about authority. He saw beyond the authoritative state and saw what's beneath it was human beings. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Zelig, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
How's it going? Yeah, I remember the conversation of authority. It brings to mind Weber's tripartite view that he had, right? He said that in the ancient world, you have the charismatic authority, and then you had the one based upon tradition, which is more based on tradition, a paternalistic one, and then today what we have is a bureaucracy one, where we listen to our policemen or politicians, not because they can do miracles or because they're heroic individuals, but because they know the law very well. We go back to the topic of the lawyer, right? If you're a successful lawyer, in today's politics, you're probably going to be in Washington, and you're going to be hired by the best. And if you go the political route, you're going to have a very successful career. And I think that most of the people in Washington are former lawyers or had careers in law. And so I think that when we look at the ancients, like Plato, right? One of the reasons that Plato didn't like the artists was that they couldn't portray the world of ideas as they were. And so the philosopher was someone that could make a common individual see the ideas through his everyday life. And so the individual that was ruled by them was like, oh, look, we're being ruled by the world of ideas, these perfect archetypes of the world, of how the world should be. And I think that's what gave authority under the Platonic view of the world, that the more that you aligned yourself with the world of ideas, the more the common person would be, yeah, we agree, that's the ideal world. But as humans progressed, then they started asking questions. Where are these ideas? And this is where we see Nietzsche, right? Say, that Plato was, he really disliked Plato or Socrates because he invented another world, a second world that was unnecessary. And that was the beginning of today's suspicion. If you hear a politician that says, the reason that I'm going to create a policy is because it reflects an ultimate reality of another world, you kind of like, yeah. And if he says in Christian terms, they're like, yeah, but do we really believe him? Not really. We don't really believe that's a reflection of ultimate reality. And what really comes down to it, the reason that people vote is, what are you going to do with Social Security? Are you going to get rid of it? And if you do, I don't care if you're a Republican or Democrat, I'm not voting for you. That's what really matters to people today. Whereas in the ancient world, especially like in the, you want to call it like, you know, the around like the, what would you say, 300s, 200s, they would ask you, what do you believe about the Trinity? And if you responded in the incorrect way, and they'll be like, oh, you're an Arian, I'm not buying anything from you or vote for you in anything whatsoever that we participate publicly, because they thought that selling and buying and doing political organizations was a reflection of an ultimate world, whether that be a Christian world. And after the common era, today we're just in a complete era of suspicion, and we have come to understand that we make our rules. It's not because of another world. It is we who make it. It is we who decide what is Social Security. And Social Security is not based upon a Platonic ideal or a Christian heavenly realm. It's just because we decided to. And so that world that we're living in, turns out that you can have individuals that say, yeah, you're not voting for a noble character individual. You're just voting for someone that knows how to work the system. And so that's what Trump says, right? Trump's like, I'm not a pastor. I'm just a politician. Yeah, because he knows how to work. He knows how to work Washington very well. And that's why a lot of people are voting for him, because he knows how to work Washington through all the years he was in New York. And so those are our conversations today, are based upon, well, does he know how to work the machine, the political machine? And it's not, does he know the Platonic idea or the Christian ideas? And I think that's where modernity we're in today. We've realized that we've killed God, according to Nietzsche, and we make what's good and evil. It's not from another world, as Heidegger would say, right? Metaphysics is dead, Heidegger would say. It is we who make it. And so, okay, now that you're basically gods, okay, let's make the world. And it turns out that we're very crappy gods. We can't solve the homelessness problem in America for decades. And it's like, but I thought we went to the moon, everybody. We went to the moon. We found calculus. You can't solve homelessness? What kind of gods are you, right? And so we're kind of disillusioned with the fact that we're very bad gods. And now we're living in that depressive, like, man, we thought we were super gods. I guess we're just mediocre gods. And now we're just like, well, you know what? Let's just return to barbarism in all kinds of ways. There's no longer any rules. If you want to be a professor, you don't even know how to technically read, how to read and write. Just, learn how to copy and paste, right? And they discovered, for example, that the leader at Harvard, I forgot her name, she basically plagiarized her thesis for Harvard. That's amazing. Like, you wouldn't need this. This is like, you got to be kidding me. One of the highest institutions in America has a leader who cheated and didn't even write anything authentically. How can this be possible? So I'm starting to buy in more into what Vico said, that there's I think what 3-4 stages. We go from the barbaric stage to the divine stage to the age of man, to the age of heroes, from the divine and the age of heroes to man, and then we descend from the age of man back to barbarism. And I think we're on that trajectory. We no longer believe we're heroes or gods whatsoever. We're barbarians, and I think we're in that stage. We're in that stage of barbarism, because we no longer believe we're either fully man or gods at all. When I think about authority.
Thank you, Zelig. So let's go to paragraph 2. I'm gonna drop part 1, the first half of it, into the chat there. So we're gonna build on what Kenneth said in the first paragraph, and as we'll keep riffing on it as we go. The ultimate stress upon an aristocratic order is the discontent of those excluded from its highest privileges, right? And this is what we see with the Banausoi and the Piraeus, needing the vote. First of all, they're only willing to come here and serve Athens and help to build it up if they get vote and they get money and they get power. But once they have those things, then they're also discontented with, restricting themselves to the things that they're good at. They now want to take the privileges of the Aristoi, They want to, they want to not only have a vote, they not only want to have a say, they want to win. They think the winning is the point. That's what they learned through their careers as Banausoi. So they want to defeat the Aristoi and change the path of foreign policy for Athens in order to please themselves. And they don't care about the long-term consequences. I mean, this is the thing that happens if you think about the position of the sophist. So I'm going to say things I don't believe because I think they will persuade you and you'll do what I want. That's sophistry, right? That's how it differs from philosophy and from authentic voting. So I said something I don't believe. And by doing that, I've fooled you, right? So you've now voted in what you think is your self-interest or in the interest of the population, but it's not, and I know it's not. And it takes you a while to notice that you've been conned. But in the meantime, I got what I wanted. So now I've got some money in my pocket. Okay, that's great for today. But what about tomorrow? Because now tomorrow, you are discovering that I've lied to you. And there have been negative consequences in the case of politics, where we're talking about policy. There are negative consequences for the whole city. So, the Banausoi talk Athens into attacking Megara, because Megara has ports on both the west and the east sides of the peninsula. So they open the gateway into the western Mediterranean, which is where the Banausoi want access, right? They want to set up the access to Syracuse and Sicily. So we set that up, but now Athens is at war with Sparta as a consequence of winning by getting what they wanted in the short term, which is we got Megara, but now we have a war. So how come the prospect of a war didn't stop the Banausoi of the Piraeus, from thinking about, from deciding to take the action to conquer Megara? Why can't they see that the long-term consequences are going to be bad? And it goes further. One of the things that Thucydides talks about is not only, in the early stages of the war, things go pretty well for Athens. They conquer Megara, they conquer a number of other places, they incite slave revolts all over the place, starting with Pylos in the south of the Peloponnese, and then spreading throughout Sparta, and they're winning militarily. They're beating them because the Athenian navy is so great, and because the Spartans can't deploy most of their troops, because if they do, there will be slave revolts. They have to keep most of their troops at home to hold their country together. Everything's going, there have been ups and downs, but things are going swimmingly for Athens, which is the point at which the Banausoi and the Piraeus talk Athens into building and launching the greatest Athenian fleet ever seen to sail off to Syracuse, to Sicily, and conquer Syracuse. In other words, they want to open up a second front to the war while they're winning. And any military strategist will tell you, why don't you win the war you're in first, right? Because this one you seem to be winning, and you could have lost and you could still lose. So why don't you settle the current conflict before you start a second conflict? But the Banausoi can't think that way. They can't, because all they see is the coins coming to them from after they conquer Sicily. And then, of course, they didn't want Megara for its own sake. They wanted it to get to Sicily. They don't even want Sicily for its own sake. They want it to get to Carthage. And they don't even want any of these things for their own sake. They want to control trade throughout the Mediterranean, be the masters of the Mediterranean world. And they can't get that vision out of their heads. Cornford talks about, in Thucydides' Myth Historicus, he talks about the way that Thucydides describes all this like an Aeschylean drama, like the Agamemnon. And in an Aeschylean drama, there are two stages, or two areas of the stage. There's the stage in which Agamemnon and Clytemnestra and the other the human characters are in their masks talking and walking. But there's the second stage that has the chorus. And in the time of Agamemnon, the chorus isn't just some generic chorus. It includes hubris, peitho, eris, ate. It includes elpis. It includes, every one of what we call the minor divinities, which are the Greek divinities that represent different aspects of the daemon within us. These are the different irrationalities, or that's a terrible word to use, The real word to use is failures of sophrosune, failures of phronesis. These are all the different ways in which we fail to have sophrosune. They're embodied in these different characterized daimons, like little gods, like, and they represent things like temptation or overconfidence or being persuaded by the wrong argument. He talks about the negative aspects of patho in this work. And so Thucydides is basically describing this whole thing like an Aeschylean tragedy, in saying, here are these people on top of the world who, if they had heeded the wisdom of centuries of literature and religion and culture, they would have known not to overreach. And he says in there that one of the critical lessons, he puts it in the mouths of the Spartans during negotiation. He says one of the critical lessons that every wise Greek knows is, when you are victorious, you should be magnanimous in your negotiations. You should be generous in negotiations, because it ensures that the peace that follows is likely to be a secure peace. The losers don't feel like they were treated shabbily. They feel like they were treated well despite losing. And so you can get the consent of the governed. They will agree to abide by the peace because they feel like they were dealt with fairly. And he shows how the Athenians are told this, and they know this, and yet because their representatives are so dominated by the Banausoi, they don't heed this, because they fail to understand the lesson that fortune is fickle. So when fortune is good to you is the time to be generous and cautious, right? When you win, it's time to rein in your hubris and your ego, because fortune could turn on you at any moment. If you want a victory, you have to end the game now while you're victorious. If you push further, if you are tempted by hope, the hope of what you could accomplish, if you mistake fortune's gifts for your own power over the world, then you'll overreach through hubris. And basically what he's describing, Cornford's describing, he's saying that Aeschylus has laid this all out in the Agamemnon and other plays as a kind of wisdom arithmetic for how the human psyche works, and how agency, going back to something Joe said like a year ago, how agency and contingency relate to each other and have to be safely navigated to keep you from ending up in tragedy. And he basically shows how they blew it, right? The Athenians blew it because they weren't thinking in these heuristic terms about sophrosune and the dangers. They were thinking in Banausic terms about how much could we win, that might makes right, and we're winning, so it must be because of our strength. And so we should deploy our strength again and again and again forever, and then we'll win forever and we'll get everything that we want. And that's the mathematics, right? Because in math, 1 + 1 + 1 is 3. It's never -3. Adding more doesn't result in catastrophe. It results in progress. So the Banausoi are thinking in this mathematical way about, now we've got Megara, then we'll add Syracuse, then we'll add Carthage. And every step of the way we get stronger and stronger, and then we win more and more and more, and we should never stop and we should grow forever. This is the way they think. They can't think about being on the wheel of fortune, and at any moment, fortune may change your mind and there could be catastrophe. And when there's catastrophe and Athens is weak, what will her enemies do to her then? How will they feel about her behavior? They can't think in those terms. It's not real to them. You can't add it in a ledger. It doesn't have the reality that a coin has. So they're incapable of taking they're incapable of taking the prudent, self-provident action. They can only take the arithmetic action that leads to hubris. It's remarkable. So, what he's saying in Thucydides Mythhistoricus is that Thucydides doesn't even fully understand that the reason for the overreach is that Solon gave the vote to the Banausoi. He doesn't fully grasp that, but he can see at an individual level that each Athenian negotiator after Pericles dies, that the people who take over after him and the people who were haranguing him before that point, trying to, egg him on, that they all thought in this way that sets up a tragedy. And so he uses the model of Aeschylus to explain the fall of Athens, rather than, say, a Marxist analysis or an economic analysis of any other sort, or any kind of modern analysis. Thucydides doesn't have those tools, says Cornford, but he does have the tool of Aeschylean tragedy. So he describes it in terms of the character of the Athenians and how the character leads to the overreach and to the inevitable catastrophic fall. It's very interesting stuff. So what we're seeing here, the way this goes back to this opening of paragraph 2, is the discontent of the Banausoi of the Piraeus at having been leashed. They've never understood why they shouldn't be allowed to just reach for what they want. They said the strong should take what they want because then they have it. And that's the end of their thinking. And once you have it, you're stronger. So you can even more take what you want. They can't think beyond that. Their character blinds them to all the subtleties that determine the actual outcomes in the end of these sorts of situations. They can't think about being magnanimous. They can't think about being cautious in the face of fortune. They can't think about acknowledging how much of their success wasn't due to their own power, but was due to luck. And so they attribute, and Thucydides makes this point clearly, they attribute their success entirely to their own power and say that none of it was luck. And that's what eggs on their hubris, their failure to recognize how tenuous their victory was. And this is why they've been discontented all along. And it's why as soon as they're given the vote and their population grows large enough, they begin to grab the steering wheel and take it out of the hands of the Aristoi. Because now at last, nobody can stop them from having what they want. You know, the way to think about this, when we very first started doing these seminars like 2.5 years ago, we talked about how the lesson of the genie and the lamp is supposed to be that our desires are misguided. We're aiming in the wrong direction. And if we get what we want, Heraclitus warns us it's going to be a catastrophe because we want the wrong things. But that moderns are incapable of hearing that lesson because we're all douloi and banausoi. We're incapable of believing that our desire isn't a god. We think we should worship our desires. And we do. You know, all the things in us that are weak and vitiating, according to the ancient worldview, we puff those things up and worship them and and we invest in them heavily. So for us, the story of the genie and the lamp is that the genie's cheating you. He's looking for some turn of phrase where you didn't say things the right way so that he can cheat you out of what's rightfully yours. And if you can just say properly your wish, then you will force the genie to give you all the good things and nothing bad will happen as a result. And we believe that down in our hearts because we're moderns. And moderns are banausoi and douloi. For us, appetite is a god. Desire is a god. And anything that gets in the way of it is some sort of cheat. We're being cheated. The idea that we're cheating ourselves and that we're our own worst enemies, this is alien to the modern worldview, but it's central to the ancient worldview. And for them, it was a class division, Aristoi versus banausoi and douloi. And it created this discontent. The people who couldn't understand the nature of tragedy demanded that they be given the same authority as people who could understand the nature of tragedy. And so once they had that authority, they set in motion great tragedies, all the while never blaming themselves, never taking responsibility for what they did, because it's out of their character to be able to see those things. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm gonna say something about the Republic, and I hope Donald will correct me where the mistakes are made. In some sense, but before I get to that, you know, it's interesting how, I'll put it in quotes, how wise General Marshall was, because instead of punishing Germany and Japan, who, by the way, deserved punishment, he was very generous to both of them, right? Because he understood, you know, I guess the First World War, that's partly what created the Second World War, because we alienated Germany in a way. And it's surprising how nicely we treated Germany and Japan. And part of that is because we needed them as allies, and we don't want to alienate that because we might end up losing all of Europe with Stalin standing in line. having said that, I think I'm going to get the Republic. It seems to me the Republic. I'm in a meetup that's studying the Republic now, and we're maybe a third of the way through, so it's by no means complete. But the way Plato sets it up, at least in the Republic, it was never manifested in reality. Was that the people who govern the state, because he was fearful of it becoming a fever state, is that they were philosophers in their own right. And philosophers love to think about all the great things and possibilities. So that the last person that wants to govern, it would take away, the daily tasks of governing, would just take them away from what they really want to do, which is to philosophize and think about, being in the world and a whole bit. So in some sense, and they're the ones that live in a very minimal life, it seems to me. I mean, they would reject any kind of worldly riches. And so therefore, if that city state, that government has succeeded, nobody will want that job because it's not like, oh, you'll get there, you're gonna get the palace, you're gonna get riches, you get all the dancing girls and all that. No, none of that's true. Right? And because the philosophers, they didn't want that. They just want to, think deep thoughts and the whole bit. And so if that were, well, the first thing is to get them even wanting to govern. I mean, it's like, once you talk them into the responsibility, of the whatever, and they adapted that, and then they would do it, but nobody wanted to take over. I mean, what you're a rich guy. Why do you want to sacrifice that and govern, not get any rewards? You have to give it all up in a sense, or at least temporarily, give it all up. And so I think that the failure of that is that we have people who at the top, and they do have the palace and they do have all the riches. And why would anybody want that? Why? Of course they would want that. And they think that, they're going to tell you that they want to do good to the Republic, to the city state, and whatever it is. But what they really want is all the good stuff. So that's a contradiction. So if you had actually had the Republic in a sense, not that I agree with totally everything, but that would be one problem solved, because nobody would want that job. Only a fool and a philosopher will want it. And even they don't want it. They have to be persuaded into doing it. So I think that's where the problem is. Why don't you do this? And you get the palace and all the good trappings. Of course you will want it. I remember when Governor Brown, somebody objected when I brought that up. Governor Jerry Brown, not Edmund Brown. Jerry Brown, what he got, he refused to move into to the governor's mansion. I think that was symbolic. It was important to me at that time. It was at Berkeley, and it's like, yeah, symbolize, like, I'm just gonna go rent an apartment and govern the state of California from the apartment. I thought that was a pretty good symbol. That's it. It just seems like, yeah, you want to remove all the lures, Oh, maybe you give them a candy bar once in a while. That's enough. Okay, that's it. Okay, Donald, you want to say something?
You did a good job, Phil. Thanks. Thank you for that. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just really briefly, I think one of the things that struck me as what you said, as well as what was stated in this paragraph here that you posted. The philosophical virtuosity is required for anyone to be able to diagnose the concrete evidence of subjective and perspectival limitations. Even though this evidence can be seen, its significance cannot be apparent just to just any and every mind. And this element of moral luck that you had actually brought up was another important part of this. Is this so that people start to think that they did it themselves, and that they don't necessarily realize that they could be in another circumstance where they would not be able to whatever achieved whatever it is that they thought they achieved. And then so all of a sudden they create this boundary where they think, this comes back to the power idea, that they think they know what's best for everyone because they've been put into a situation where now they think, oh, well, look, I did this all on my own, and I know what to do. I know what it. The other thing is that it destroys any kind of human connection and empathy as well. So in the sense that you kind of have this, you don't say, well, therefore that could be me. So that you don't necessarily look to someone else's circumstances as the possibility that you may not be, you could be in a situation that you're determining that someone is shouldn't be in some way, shape, or form. So, I mean, and what this is, again, I think that this is this inability to understand limits and boundaries. Ultimately, that's what this is all about, right? So, and there's a limit of self-knowing within that, right? So now my boundary that I create because I think that I know it, whatever my success is one aspect of that, and then I start to think I should impose my will on everyone else, as opposed to actually taking the feedback and understanding that the position that you're in is only in the position you're in because of the, by some luck, by some, element of, certain, you're just fortunate. Anyway, so I think it's an important part when we understand limits, is that how it relates to our human relationships, and how we relate to one another. So by, again, thinking about it from a perspective of not thinking about it from a perspective of luck, and thinking about it self-made, and that's something that is actually permeates through the culture, obviously, in the United States in particular. But also this element of well, I won't go into the whole thing with self-made, what it really was stemmed from and how it's been distorted since the days of kind of Frederick Douglass. But that's a whole nother conversation. But anyway, I think you kind of get what I'm saying.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's right on. These issues of the limits and why you have to limit yourself, and what's at stake and how wrong can it go. This is the I'm just gonna share the link again. This is F.M. Cornford, Thucydides Mythostoricus. And I gotta say, for something that sounded like it was going to be a niche interest, this turned out to be a really useful general book on the ancient worldview. It's just in countless different ways, and part of it was the way that it said that this kind of wisdom arithmetic of character, and in navigating the treacherous shoals of how agency and contingency relate, that this is, on the one hand, this is the thing that only the Aristoi takes seriously. But on the other hand, it's made freely available to everyone. I mean, Aeschylus's plays are being, performed publicly all over the place. Even slaves can go see it. Anybody can go see this stuff. And that's being done on purpose because, the entire ancient Greek perspective is, before we took wisdom seriously, we destroyed everything and threw ourselves into a dark age. Our greatest heroes are also our greatest villains. And it was through their heroic qualities that they wrecked everything. And that has taught us a lesson that most people never learn, which is that our biggest problem is ourselves. Aristotle says it right out. Multiple writers say it right out. We've reached a stage in human development, they say, where most of the time the greatest catastrophes could have been avoided if we just hadn't behaved in such a stupid way, that we're the source of our main problems. And so with that as your core for developing a civilization, your approach to making decisions is going to be very different than if you think like Americans, where you think it's a great march of progress. We colonized, we got rid of the savages, we tamed the wilderness, and we made everything better century by century, and now we're the best of all, and next year we'll be even best. It will be even better than the best. And this is sort of our vision of history and governance and decision making, which couldn't be further away from we wrecked everything and we have to learn the bitter lessons or we'll do it again, which is the old framework. So it's not an accident that Agamemnon and all these other plays are over and over not just dramatizing the outward behavior of the characters on the stage, but are simultaneously dramatizing the inward drama of the character. And it's the different conflicts and energies within it that are pulling each actor one direction and then another direction. And that what they're trying to do is make visible the invisible thing that wrecked civilization. I'm trying to put it right in front of your eyes so that you can learn it as clearly as you can learn, Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock and Dr. McCoy, that you can learn this is how the dialogue happens that leads to crisis and catastrophe. To trying to popularize this understanding. But even despite that kind of relentless pressure to spread it everywhere, they're still finding that they can't get more than a third of the population to take it seriously. The others enjoy it, but then they go home and they continue being just who they were, all driven by their experiences or driven by their ideologies. So anyway, thanks for bringing that up, Joe. Ginny, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Rick, as you were talking about Athenians, I was thinking, is Russia behaving the same way, do you think, Russia?
I think it's very hard for us to answer that question. Most of the discussion that happens in Russia about what they're doing and why they're doing it never gets reported in our press. We're still sort of taking a Cold War approach to documenting what Russia does. And that means, there's a certain amount of our news about Russia that's externals. So-and-so invaded here, so-and-so bombed this, there was an atrocity there. And, that's more or less true as far as it goes. But whenever we talk about their motivation and what they're trying to do, we always do it in a way where we've got our thumb heavily on the scale to make sure that we never talk about any of the things we did that might have provoked the current conflict. And we also never talk about, any of the ways in which the decision making makes sense from a Russian perspective, even if it doesn't make sense from our perspective. We always do it as, oh, they're bad, crazy people. And as long as we do that, it's going to be impossible for any of us to understand what's really happening in this war. If only there were a Thucydides today who could walk around to all these people and talk to them and find out what they really said, then we might be in a position to we can evaluate what went wrong between Athens and Sparta because of the personal integrity of Thucydides and his approach to history. But nobody's writing journalism like that today on what's happening, between Ukraine and Russia and the West. So I hesitate to answer your question because I don't think I'm well informed enough on this, even after reading the news.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Ginny. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I was just going to bring up the point again that seems to be getting aired now, that there seems to be a trend that our ambitions and appetites are the God. We don't have to change our ideas. If we're not succeeding, there can be only one problem. That is not enough power. So more power is always better. This isn't yin and yang. This isn't, Confucius, or this isn't anybody else in the axial ages, so to think, well, maybe balance. is a better way to go about things. It seems to have been tossed out the window lately. You know, people, how do I cope with my life? More power, energy drinks, methamphetamines. That's a solution. No, not that I can be mistaken or have a dumb idea, or maybe there's a different way of handling things, you know, whatever, what they used to call lateral thinking. No. Well, this is Faust in a sense because it's sophist. All I need to do to punch through the wall is enough power. So this is widespread now. It doesn't seem to be too many people that are saying anything different. How do we solve the problem with Russia? We don't call a ceasefire, which was a possibility a couple of years ago when they were reeling backwards from their initial attack. They might have taken up the offer back then. Our solution to Russia is more power. I read a book years ago called The New Maginot Line. And the guy was saying that with all this stuff about Star Wars and high-tech weapons, that the West is creating a new Maginot Line. They believe that they'll have the unstoppable defense. And I wondered, was he right? And, well, you know, the recent argument in the last couple of years is really who had the most dumb artillery shells. That was a hotly sought after property. North Korea, any backward state, if you've got some dumb artillery shells, which I can just fire with go, well, smart weapons were good. They just weren't good enough. You know, the smart weapons like the Javelin were very costly. And often they'll destroy a Russian tank that was actually cheaper than the weapon. So this attitude, the fist, the power, give me enough power, that's all I need. I don't need to question my thinking or question my objectives or think that maybe there's a different way of doing things. Power is the answer. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen. And of course, in that, we're emulating our conscious role models, the Roman Empire. You know, we think we're going to replace a Pax Romana with a Pax Americana because we've got more science and more more technology, more military might, so we could be an even bigger Roman Empire, we figure. But it'll be a sneaky Roman Empire where, you know, we won't be in there punching them all the time in the face. We'll just do it economically. And so we'll say we're all about democracy, while at the same time we'll get them trapped in this labyrinth of economics that they can't find their way out of. But of course, in all of that, we're ignoring Tacitus and countless people. I mean, more power is good. Well, what does Nietzsche warn us about? He says power makes stupid. The more power you have, the stupider you get, the more you think, well, power must be the answer to every problem. You stop thinking about, maybe I need to understand the situation better. You know, if you don't have power and you have to solve a problem, then you have to understand the problem. You have to study it. But if you have power, you could just hit it with a hammer and make it go away, or so you think. That's, you know, the problem of power. That's how it makes us stupid. So, but again, you know, even that's on the brutal side. When we're open and we just openly, brutally say our intentions, Nietzsche's there to tell us, yeah, well, that's stupid. That's not going to work. It's going to fail in the long run. But even when we try to speak of our values and we say, well, we're not here to brutalize people. We're here to spread human rights. We believe in human rights, especially places that have oil. They need a lot of human rights, and we're going to bring it to them. You know, well, Tacitus was there to talk about the Pax Romana, and 2,000 years hasn't changed this assessment of the Pax Americana either, which is they make a desolation and they call it peace. You know, just because you wrecked places and prevented them from fighting back doesn't mean that anybody has any peace. You know, the relentless flood of refugees from Central America caused by our half a century of destabilizing every government down there and backing every thug that we could find, resulting in sort of rule by gangs, this is our own blowback coming back on us. And we think we can solve it by building a wall, which will just push the problem over there and keep it from coming back to us. But fate isn't so weak. Fate and fortune are potent forces, as the Greeks understand. And there's no wall you can build. There's no hammer you can make. There's no smart missile that you can make that can prevent us from being victimized by the consequences of our own actions. We set in motion things that continue to carry on long after we repent and wish that we hadn't done it. That's part of the nature of power. One of the advantages of not having power is it limits the scale of the damage that you can do. The more power you have, the more damage you can set in motion. So I'm right there with you, Stephen. These are critiques that were popularly available to everybody in the ancient Greek world. They were talked about all the time in every story, relentlessly. Whereas we're doing superhero stories about how with more power you can solve your problems. If only I was the Hulk, I could smash everything that got in my way. Isn't that great? And granted, the stories, the people who tell these stories try to work more nuance into them than that. But it becomes clear when you read people's reviews of these films how many of them is the nuance and subtlety of the consequences of power that's in those stories lost on them, and all they can see is, yeah, I want to be the Hulk. I've got some things I need to smash. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, fantastic. I love this discussion. I always wanted to frame it in terms of a modern philosopher, Slavoj Žižek, if you've heard of him. He is Slovenian, and he's amazing. He, at the same time, will, in one phrase, talk about Stoicism and then a South Park episode. So he's really good at bringing lots of different things. But no, he talks about, he's majorly, what we're doing is interesting. A lot of what we're talking about is what he frames neoliberalism, which is this idea of the individual is sanctified, and that just get government out of the way, and then we'll have, everybody will be able to participate in the market freely. It's almost like Ayn Rand garbage. And it's this idea that an unrestricted anarchy will lead to peace and prosperity because the state is the problem. And he's recognized without the state, other actors just fill the role of the state, and they, like corporations or whatever. Then the state is actually just some sort of transactive body for these other more powerful entities. But that's not really the focus here. What he talks about in the primary of neoliberalism is this idea of the individual always getting more power. And it's true, actually, if you had universal individuals with all similar amounts of power, and they had a certain set of rules that could govern them, like a traffic light where they universal red lights and universal green lights everybody obeys, then everybody will follow this sort of neoliberal behavior. But he talks about, the idea of getting rid of the state is like getting rid of the red lights and the green lights, and then you'll have no accidents in the intersection, or people will go through the intersection more smoothly, which is nonsense. And so what we're talking about here is this: if you remove the red lights and the green lights, you give the individual, or you give America, the Pax Americana, more power to just zoom through, and you can't see that you're going to crash into all these other things along the way. And it's such an interesting idea that this isn't him, this is me actually from Batman. Is like, we're just dogs chasing cars, and this is the Joker. This is the phrase here. We're just dogs chasing cars. And so the idea is, in the true quest for power, if you get the car, if you get if you've done chasing, then you have nothing to chase anymore, right? And you're done. So really, power, and I feel like what Nietzsche's saying in this will to power is, it's more about the will and less about the power. And if we wanted to phrase this in terms of, I don't know how much you guys know about neurochemistry or neurobiology, but this is related to dopamine. And dopamine is the drug of more, always wanting more. And really, it's framed well in the brain when you have other things like acetylcholine or norepinephrine, which are balancing things. They bring focus or vigilance or anxiety. Really, the balancing thing of dopamine is norepinephrine, because epinephrine in the case gives you anxiety. This sort of, whoa, maybe I'm going to wreck things if I go into the intersection fast. And dopamine's like, nope, I just want to go faster. Right? And so we're stuck on this dopamine trip, and this makes sense because all the things we consume and do in Americana to just have more and more and more reflects this desire to just get more and more hits of dopamine. And what we're doing is when you're stuck in a world of pure dopamine, it takes more and more of these other neurochemistry to balance you out. And really, this idea of having more power is, we don't actually want more power. More power is not what we want. We just want the imaginary feeling of getting more power or getting the next. It's more about expectations. And if you actually were to conquer these guys and make the wasteland and call it peace, you're like, well, now what do I do? I don't have anywhere else to go. I don't know. And so this is this idea, and Zizek calls it Lacanian desire. I don't actually know the reference from where it comes before, but it sounds old. And it's this idea that all of these pleasures or powerful things we're seeking after in humanity, most of them we don't actually want. Like, if we actually got it, we would be unhappy, right? Because then you wouldn't have a quest for more power. It's like if you get the Grail, well, then you don't need the knights anymore, and you don't need the quest, and then there's nothing, right? You just have it, and there's nothing to do. The story ends. Really, as simply says, but if you get the power, so in all the words, like when you say this, it was beautiful in the Peloponnesian Wars, and they just want to open up a new front. They don't want to win wars. They just want more excitement, right? They just want more and more, and they can't see what more is bringing more destruction, right? And it's just so fascinating that this is exactly where we're at with the superhero. Like, I love in the Affinity Wars, the part of me that I'm a philosopher like you, I focused on this at the very end, that Iron Man has to give up all power. He has to make the sacrifice. It's very Jesus-y, right? A lot of people got that, this sacrifice, and at least Jesus does that for us, that he shows us that real power is something different. If nothing more, I don't have to agree with what Jesus did or what he didn't do, but you could see the model right from a very childish point of view, that if he is the ultimate power, which is like the Son of God or something, he doesn't use power in the Roman or American. He does something very different. And if just to start with this idea that it's different invites a whole range of opportunities and a complex richness that can unfold. But as soon as you have this sort of very simplistic, more power means more success, then you have no reason to question that. And if you ever start questioning it, then you got to stamp out those questions, right? That's the problem here, right? Power has to destroy its criticisms, which is so self-defeating and so self-nullifying. And I think this is the lesson of Aeschylus. And he's showing the slaves this too, and a beautiful, I love it. And he's showing everybody this, and it's like ruining the mythology of the people at the top. Are like, no, I don't want them to learn this, because then they'll see how it's actually just going to kick us in the butt later. And I think a lot of I do have hope in humanity, and I think it was Ginny talking about what's happening with Russia. I don't actually know, but if I was to characterize it, I would say it's very simply, this is a resurgence of male aggression in the form of endlessly seeking power, in the form of Putin's like, we're going to be power, return to empire. And it's very interesting too that Zizek points out that a lot of what we want, interestingly, you're pointing it in terms of the Romans, is we don't believe our future is going to be better anymore. Maybe it's pretty reasonable because of climate change or whatever else. So as a natural response, we become nostalgic. We want to return to the Roman Empire. And we reframe the Roman Empire as some sort of mythological perfection as opposed to this failure, right? And so the Russian Empire and the greatness of the Soviet Empire, this is to some degree what I believe Putin wants. He's getting the people to be nostalgic about their past, as opposed to like, no, if anybody experienced that, if you know people, I knew people, like one of my neighbors got out of there, and he's a teacher now, but he was like he talks about how horrible it was, right? The young people don't remember that. They have no access to how horrible it was in the Soviet Empire and how awful things were. But no, they're just creating this mythology of nostalgia that we're going to return, and it's through the use of classic male aggression power. And we see in this world, like, male aggression power leads to bombs in Hiroshima, and that's gonna kill us all. So like, it's interesting that there's this return to a nostalgic, and this is not my own again, this is pure Zizek. He talks about this weirdness of chasing things that you don't want, and that's what power does. And then also the strangeness that it's about nostalgia about things that most people, when they experience them, weren't very good. So it's really fascinating I think you talked about this too, this weird inversion of things. I don't know how that quite relates there, but maybe it was Phil that talked about this I don't know, he was just going to interrupt. He's had these two words, a contingency versus something else. And those are two mutually not exclusive, but it's like you have one of the other, you have less of the other, right? If you have more power, you have less contingency almost. You have less capabilities of adjusting and I see this as like a race car moving faster and faster, faster. The faster you move, the harder it is to adjust your course. But if you slow down, then you can start to rethink, and that gives you more contingency, perhaps. I'm not sure if that's the right model. I'd love to hear him respond in his own words. His words are beautiful. If you don't mind me giving you guys compliments, I really like the way he talks in a way that's just basically very different for me, even though we're oftentimes describing something very similar. We're using different language, and I really enjoy that. So I'll leave it open to whoever wants to respond. But to me, I felt confused about the contingency. I can't even say the other word, the contingency versus the other. And that dichotomy, I loved learning about that.
Thank you, Ari. Yeah, agency versus contingency was something
Agency, thank you, agency.
Joe brought this to us about a year ago as a pair of terms, and we realized that it really captures the ancient perspective on the relationship between free will and determinism. That they see them not as it's either one or the other, but it's a dialectic between the two, and that dialectic is a powerful system. But it means that you can't always get what you're trying to get, but you also can't just sit back and let the universe hand you whatever it has in mind. You have to struggle to try to bring things about, so that's willful, that's your ego in action. But you also have to be, try to harmonize with the actual circumstances that are happening, and not try to, run yourself right up under a steamroller or something. There's a way in which the outcomes of things are contingent upon the larger picture, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't exert your agency to try to change the world. You have to respect both sources of change at the same time. And in the modern world, especially, most people just pick one or the other and say that's the answer to all. It's either you can do anything you want, you just have to be egotistical enough, or let's be depressed, why bother? The forces of history will determine what comes out, and I'll just sit here twiddling my thumbs. This seems to be the choices that we drop ourselves into in our failure to understand this ancient perspective that it's a dialectic between the two. So I'm really grateful to Joe for having brought that to my attention. I think it really captures that critical dialectic in a way that gives us something to chew on. It's really meaningful. So thanks, Ari. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, usually you don't run your way into a steamroller. The problem with the steamroller is you try to pick up nickels in front of the steamroller. That's what the problem is. Try to make a few pennies and end up losing your life. At first I want to speak about nature, but since Ukraine brought up, I have to address that. I want to tell you that I'm unabashedly support Ukraine. And I've been not only supporting them, I've been giving them money, which I could hardly afford. In fact, I would have given that money to the Democrats, except I thought Ukraine deserves it more. And I think I understand Russia, the reason for Russia. For Russia to maintain its integrity, it has, because it's a huge, huge country. Okay, I'll address that in a moment. It is a huge, huge country, and the problem is defending the country from others, particularly the Polish Gap, because both Napoleon and Hitler approached Russia, and Moscow is not that far away from the Polish Gap. And they have to defend that because previously they succeeded in defending that because of the Russian winter. And I think with modern technology, the Russian winter is not going to be as difficult to penetrate. Also, they have to have access to the Baltic Sea, which means Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Lithuania will have to go in order to have access to the sea that runs all the way to Kaliningrad. They have to also block the Romanian pass as well. They have to block many others, which they've succeeded in doing, the one in Georgia, the one in Kazakhstan. So all of that it's just too much control. And all that actually is not a natural territory of Russia. Russia was a Eastern European power, and they conquered particularly this Far East because of the czars. In fact, it wasn't because of the Soviets, it was the czars. And that was, so what Russia is a internalized colonial power with many nation states wrapped up into it. And they're very, very concerned about blocking those paths because they're going to have enough trouble controlling the internal dynamics of many, many actually colonial powers that want to be independent. Okay. As we see in Chechnya, they fought a terrific war against them, you know, and so they're afraid of all sorts of external invasions. So it is necessary for them to hold those passes to block it because they do not have the population to hold against, let's say, 9 gaps in order to contain it. But the thing is, Russia should naturally have been a kind of European power. And in a sense, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great understood that, and that's why they moved into Ukraine and into Crimea in order to, in a sense, hold those powers to be. And Crimea is important because it controlled the Black Sea. So all that has to do with power and retaining the form that the czars had and the Soviet Union had. So this is an existential problem for the state that it wants to be. What should have happened was when the Cold War ended, you know, with Gorbachev, and too bad Gorbachev was overthrown because Gorbachev might have moved it in the right direction. There would have been a better sort of conciliation with the West, and the West should have been more embracive of Russia, but it was not. It was not possible because Russia was very, very corrupt by that time, and so when a kind of capitalist, sort of semi-liberal society was happening, then what happened was that it really became a state of bandits and thieves that actually stole the money from the government and continued to do so. So if that had succeeded at that time, if Gorbachev had not gone, in some sense, it might have became a sort of like glasnost with all of Europe, and it would become European power. But I think it would have eventually had to give up Siberia and everything, in a sense, east of the Euro, which is actually foreign countries in many ways that they control. So I think this is an existential problem for Russia, and that's why they needed to invade Ukraine as a beginning stage, because even there they can't stop. They have to go on to Poland, all the way to Warsaw. And Poland does not want that. Absolutely not. And that's why the Polish government is very adamant about defending themselves. And that the Poland and all the Baltic states as well. The Baltic states had lived under the Soviet Union, and they do not want to return back to Russia. Okay, so there's some struggle between the two sides. It's like caught between a rock and a hard place. Neither side wants to give up. That's why there's a war, because Russia needs the Polish gap, and that's the reason. And Ukraine does not want to be the pathway to the Polish gap, because they would be reunified into the Soviet Union and Russia. And that's the reason why there's a problem. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil, for sharing your take with us. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, just really quickly, I just, since this agency and contingency thing just come up again, I think that it is good to look at it like a dialectic and relating it back to just what I was talking about a little bit earlier with this idea of moral luck, right? You may be lucky to be in a particular situation, but you still have to pursue something. So there is this almost kind of dialectic between, the situation that you're in. Now, the opposite extreme would be I was born to do this, right? That's where it's this rigid kind of perspective that somehow you're anointed, right? And that comes back to this idea about power as well, and how that creates this this divide of that someone thinks that they should be in charge of telling everybody what to do, and that obviously creates a dynamic that doesn't necessarily benefit anyone, including the person that thinks that they're in power. But one of the interesting things that that I been covering and with reading Cicero lately is that a lot of time this element that we need to be protected from ourselves, and that is something that Kenneth kind of keeps coming back to, and Cicero said, even the most benevolent of leaders will become a tyrant, and that the populace will inevitably lean towards populism or mob spirit, if you will, and so therefore you want some type of control for those, and that's where it was kind of the ideas of kind of empowering different branches of government in order to distribute power was something that even the founders could consider. So, but nonetheless, what I'm thinking is that there's this element of agency and contingency with understanding, and it actually all comes back to boundaries differently. But the moral luck component, and that there's the understanding that you still have to pursue and change the way you act upon the situation that you're in, and that comes back to also what you're pursuing is good with virtue, because if you're put in a situation that you can pursue, we can always pursue what is good, but that you can pursue virtue is because it's beneficial both to you and the other individual. And that is an action. That's a choice. And your situation may, permit you to make that action a little bit easier, I should say. But the reason it's good is because if we change the input, then that's a way of actually changing the people then around us. So it's something that we control, but it comes back to the whole thing is that there is this dialectic between agency and contingency, and there is a balance between determinism, the causality, and how we act. And so anyway, that was a long way of saying about how the structures and how we need to be protected from ourselves, the situation that we're born in the outcomes, and what we should pursue. Those are the main points that I was trying to make, and I was a little bit convoluted in doing so.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, see, this whole situation of Ukraine is a lot deeper than it's been presented. Up until so many years ago, Ukraine was a client state of Russia. Whether it's a good or bad thing, it was how things. Now that sort of got undermined, and it's a question whether the Orange Revolution, as they call it, was genuine. But this is the West extending its empire. It's always been the dream. If we can eliminate Russia, as Napoleon fought, as Hitler fought, that's that whole front. We don't have to worry about it anymore. We can start occupying ourselves with other things. And my problem is more, I don't think it's going to work. And this is Spengler too. Spengler said, look, the Russians aren't like you. We in the West think our particular position on everything is the pinnacle of human development, the absolute pinnacle. But we can't be absolutely sure about that. But there's a lot of people that are very sure about it. And the entire motive is they're convinced they can win. Actually, it's somebody was telling me that, say, in Germany, they're rolling out the tanks and stuff. They used to keep all this stuff hidden, but just in the last few weeks, everything's on display. And this thing, it's like Crimea. You know, people are saying, well, Russia has no justification to Crimea. That Russia acquired Crimea at the same time the United States became the United States. Now, if you're going to argue that principle, you can go back to the 1840s and say, well, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California belonged to Mexico. How did the United States acquire those little bits of property? If you're going to start playing the game of absolutist moral high grounds, I mean, is the United States going to give those states back to Mexico? Is anybody even suggesting? I think there have been a few rumours. Yeah, I think this story is being told a little bit one-sidedly. Other things that are overlooked was the treatment of Russians inside Ukraine. That was an issue. That became an issue. And this is part of the reason you got, besides Crimea, which was pretty solidly Russian, these other two breakaway states. And it's sort of like Russia is the master villain, but part of it's a question that if they keep on allowing themselves to be nibbled away at, what's next? Belarusia, and then actual Russia. My problem with it all is, if it could work, maybe you got an argument. But I think even if they succeed in beating the Russians back, it's still going to be there. They're going to find themselves having to protect the frontier against a belligerent group like the Russians. The very reverse of what their ambition is. They believe, once we can knock Russia out, that's worried. Our hands are freed to deal with all those other little disobedient people around the world. And that's, that's my question. I don't fully subscribe to this whole thing that was running around where people, were dancing around with the blue and gold. And even if you're right, it's a problem of power. Russia is powerful. They don't give up. It seems the worst thing you can do to Russia is leave them alone and then they fall apart. But if you actually create opposition with them, I don't know if that's actually a way of succeeding against the Russians. Putin's won in a sense because now he's got the population of Russia more solidly united behind him. I mean, you're a Russian and you're reading the Western press that's comparing you to some sort of ape that's only worthy of extermination or absolute control. This is what's in the Western press. Yeah, I just don't know if it's as our position in the West is just so marvelous as has been made out. Thank you.
Hey, Stephen, you have to explain that when Russia invaded Ukraine, which they did, okay, maybe they have a right to do it, but they started it in a sense. Why did Finland and Sweden, who have been non-aligned nations for 150 years, join NATO? Why did that happen? I mean, they didn't have to join NATO. They were doing perfectly fine. I think it was because of the invasion. Why did thousands, hundreds of thousands of Russians leave Russia and try to go to Eastern Europe or Turkey and somewhere else? So it's not like everything in Russia is great, that actually the most educated people wanted to leave. Why did they leave? Everything is fine. I wouldn't want to leave. So there's got to be something
So
also.
what year did the war start?
Yeah, they left because of the war.
No, I mean, what year did the war start?
Well, it depends how far back you want to go.
At this point, I'm going to jump in and say, maybe somebody should schedule a talk that's all about Ukraine and Russia. Obviously, we could spend 3 hours talking about it. We could spend, an endless number of hours talking about it. But if we do that, we're never going to get through this text.
Yeah, that's right.
And I've got a lot of things to say about Ukraine and Russia, but I'm sort of, keeping a lid on it because I'd like us to be able to make progress with the text as well. So
I didn't bring it up.
so I thank you both for your comments. I do, and this is interesting stuff, but I don't think we're going to get to the bottom of it on this call. So I'm going to call on Donald, and then I'm going to take us to the text. Go ahead, Donald.
I think for those who want to talk about this, they should watch. They're available on YouTube. Timothy Snyder's The Making of Modern Ukraine. He's professor of Eastern European history at Yale. And as a result of the current interest, I guess he put together this lecture series. Starting, it's something about, a lot of facts that I think, need to be aware of before you talk about it. And those that want to should go listen to what this guy has to say. That's all.
Yeah, that's actually still on my list to watch. Thanks for reminding me. I might start watching that this week. Try to bring myself a little more up to date. For purposes of rounding out today's session, I'm going to take us back to the sophists, and I'm going to finish that opening sentence of paragraph 2 that we started looking at. So he started by saying that the ultimate stress on an aristocratic order is the discontent of those excluded from its highest privileges. But he then continues, for the privileges that explain its system of order are truly esoteric matters. And he's italicizing both principles and esoteric to warn us that these are not the standard English definitions. These are key ancient Greek concepts, comprehensible in a complete degree only to those aristoi whose business it is to secure the polis's foundations. So he's saying that the problem that we have here is that we might think that, and we might even say that, and I did earlier in this call, that consent of the governed is an essential part of a successful society, and that this is what Hannah Arendt is talking about in part in her chapter "What is Authority?" chapter 3 in her book Between Past and Future. But there's more to it than that from the ancient perspective. That might be a modern perspective, and I think many of us share that idea. But the ancients had a deeper perspective than that. That the consent of the governed is necessary, but not sufficient. It's not enough that everybody goes along with it. You also have to be doing the right thing, which is a completely separate question from whether the majority agrees with you or not. Now, to a modern, that's inconceivable. The right thing is subjective, whereas counting votes is objective. So obviously the will of the majority is a real thing, and principles and the like, that's just fluffy talk. That doesn't really mean anything. But from the ancient perspective, the all-important question is your species harmonizing with the larger realm of nature? Is it being true to its own, to our own inner nature, as well as to the nature around us, in such a way that it's creating a viable expression of both of them, so that the species can survive and can be healthy? That's the question. Aristotle talks about the arete over and over and over. What is the arete of Homo sapiens? Kata phuse, according to nature, what is it that we are driven to do? And then likewise, according to nature, how much of that can actually come to fruition in a healthy way? These are the overriding concerns of Greek culture. And none of that is present in the question of who gets the majority of the vote. This is similar to the great critique of the U.S. presidency, is that there's essentially no meaningful restrictions on who can be president. You can have for president someone whose life purpose is to destroy himself, the country, and the world, and according to the Constitution, that's just great. As long as he's got the votes, that's the right person. That's who should be president. There's no deeper analysis than that of what's required for leadership. And from the ancient perspective, that's insane. Literally not sane. Certainly, it's a violation of sophrosune and phronesis. The critical concerns are, who is concerned with securing the foundations of the polis, by which we don't mean, shields and walls in the military. That's just brute force. But we mean, who is ensuring that the polis is organized according to the principles of nature, so that and pointing in the direction of phronesis and sophrosune, so that the polis can survive in a healthy fashion. That's the critical question from the ancient perspective. And their critique is that Aristoi are not talking about class here, but talking about character types. Aristoi are those human beings who have finished developing a fully mature adult mind. And as part of that, they have learned to be skeptical about their appetites and experiences, and they've learned to be skeptical about their ideologies and systems. And they've learned that both of those things have to be leashed to the question of what is actually healthy. And only then do you get good decision making. So since they're the only people who do that, they're the only people qualified to protect the foundations of the polis. And therefore, they're the only people who should be governing. This is the sort of political character level mathematics that the ancients are seeing in this. Even the Romans, as rotten as they are when they become an empire, even the Romans continue to play lip service to this, because this is the idiom in which the ancient world expressed its ideas. Just like in the medieval world, even the most corrupt atheist would say that he's chosen by God and is doing what God wants, because that's how you get people to back you in the medieval world. Witness Joan of Arc, where everybody rallies around an illiterate peasant girl because they actually believe she's in touch with God. That's authority to the medievals. And to the ancients, real authority has to consist of, caring about, paying attention to, and being sensitive to the question of what actually leads to survival and health. And the recognition that most people don't seem to care. And that the people who don't care can't be trusted with the governance of things, because you know what they're going to do with it. The douloi are going to satisfy their appetites if you give them power, and at the expense of everybody else. And the banausoi, if you give them power, are going to satisfy their ideologies, their sort of boundless desires to fulfill the systems of logic that they think according to. And you have to rein both of those things in to avoid catastrophe. So this is what Kenneth's talking about in the opening of paragraph 2. And so it's going right to the heart of how the ancient world organized itself and the crisis that's happening around the time of the Peloponnesian War. Donald, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
I think one other point here is that we think of consent. The only way that the governed can express consent is through voting. On his deathbed, Socrates just says, you know, well, I never chose to leave Athens. I'm content. I must agree with its laws. You know, I'm free to go, and I don't. There are other ways to have consent of the governed, other than that everybody gets a vote. That, you know, it might also be for modernity, that when some people don't get to vote, we always say that's a threat to our democracy. It might be preserving our democracy. Depends on who doesn't get the vote, though.
Thank you, Donald. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, first of all, I'm gonna have to leave soon because I have another meeting coming up.
Yeah.
But I want to say that, you know, before the ancients, even, you know, all through civilization, probably for 10,000 years or more, it's been this whole thing about nature. We've been very exclusionary of nature. We're talking about human nature, controlling human nature, having a society. What about the rest of life? And I'm not excluding myself from this horror that we put on nature itself. If we're so concerned about nature, why don't we ever extend some understanding to nature deserves a place as well? I mean, it's been one restriction after another, so that we have perhaps built a better society, perhaps not, but we've never thought of nature at large. We've always exploited them as a object to add to our surplus. I'm not sure whether if I live in a different society, I would be able to adhere to something that's beyond humanistic. I don't want to use the word transhumanism, because that seems like androids and robots. But you know, and so therefore, even the way we talk about it, ever since civilization began, is that we have drawn the red line around that in ourselves, and we dare to talk about nature as a governing principle. That's bullshit. I'll just put it that way. And that's a comment I wanted to make from the beginning, why I diverted myself to talking about Ukraine. So maybe we should devote a little bit more attention to nature as such.
Thank you, Phil. I appreciate it. Yeah, and it's another thing that one could question. We might get into more of this next week about to what extent were the ancients true to their professed, concern for nature as a source of order, and to what extent did they deviate from that and abuse nature whenever they thought they could get away with it. These are legitimate questions. What we can say about the ancient world order is that they were not indigenous. It was a colonizer mindset. So there's ways in which it's not going to be dealing with nature quite as well as it claims to. I guess final comment today goes to Zelig. So come off mute, tell us what's on your mind, and then we'll wrap up.
And I'm thinking about the idea of the consent of the governed. We're kind of living a little bit in the times where Christianity has influenced us by the idea of, if you think about baptism, right? Like when you accept Jesus in today's American evangelical tradition, you baptize yourself. It is your consent that you came and you worship the Lord Jesus. And you compare that to the ancient Hebrew Old Testament practice, where at 8 days old, you were circumcised and you were a part of the tribe. You were not given a chance to be a part of the community. you grew up and you turned at a conscientious age, and you're like, you're telling me I belong to this religion and this society because my foreskin was cut off? Yeah. And you've been a part of it since you were born, and you're like, I never gave consent to, because you were chosen. And I think the influence of Christianity in America, where we choose God, God doesn't choose us. It's a kind of like it's in America, we believe that there's a dialectical relationships between us and ultimate reality. That it is until we decide to enter into a relationship with this ultimate reality, then I consent. But the ancient view, at least of the Hebrew world, was you're chosen and you don't have a say. At 8 days old, you don't have a say. You're chosen from before the foundation of the world. And so I think in America, when it comes to viewing nature, right, Phil's question about whether we care about nature, we kind of look to the Old Testament where it says, man was given the ability to be the Lord over all creation. But then we actually take a little bit of Christianity, at least as it has evolved through the Roman Empire and the Western civilization, and say, but when it comes to me, I'm not part of that nature. God doesn't rule me. I'm not chosen. I get to decide when and not. Certain things can happen with me. But nature, we're supposed to rule over it, and it doesn't have a say. And so I think we're kind of in that world of, we're either like in this mix of Rome, the Western civilization of Christianity, and we kind of still want to go back to the Hebraic tradition, where we kind of apply there is no consent of nature. If we don't interrogate it at all, even though we look at climate change and nature's telling us, like, if you keep pumping these stupid fumes into the environment, you're gonna see changes of weather a lot sooner than the normal cycle, right? And so we have means of interacting with nature. And so I think it's that dynamic of Christianity that it is upon our will to kind of accept this ultimate reality, but it is until we give the consent, and we've kind of lost touch of that ancient, at least the ancient Hebrew worldview, where we're chosen. We don't choose. I think that we've lost that definitely in modernity.
Thank you, Zelig. And that wraps us up for this week. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion as much as I did, and I'm looking forward to continuing with more in paragraph 2 of section H next week. So have
That
a
was
great
fantastic. Thank you. I don't want to jump in, but I really appreciate. Oh my God, it was so beautiful. Zelig, that was great. Thank you for that was so nice. Thank you.
wasn't it? Yeah. That's a great bunch of people. Everybody's got really interesting perspectives. I really enjoy these discussions. So have a great week, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Bye, Rick.
Bye, Donald.